Okay, there we go. All right. I call to order the Open Space Board of Trustees meeting of November 13th, 2019. The first item on the agenda is approval of the minutes from last month's meeting. Does anyone have any changes? Nope. Okay, do we have a motion?
Make a motion to approve the minutes.
Second.
Okay, all in favor? Okay, that's unanimous. The second item is public comment for items not identified for a public hearing. The two items that are set for public hearing are the agreement with the Boulder Rifle Club and the Shanahan acquisition. So if you want to speak to us about any other subject, this would be the time to do it. I think you've all spoken to us before. We'll follow our usual procedure, 3 minutes each and 5 if you're pooling. The first is Hans Price, then Andre Hausny, then Elena Zubulaki. And as always, introduce yourself, give us your address.
Good evening, trustees. Hans Price, 1719 Mariposa Avenue. I'm speaking on behalf of the Boulder Mountain Bike Alliance. I would like to give you an update on the trail building that we did this past season. We had a total of 8 trail building events with OSMP. 173 people showed up and donated 610 hours to the trails. That includes about 60 high school students from Fairview High School. This year we focused on the Dowdy Draw downhill between the Flatirons Vista and the brook crossing down below, which was very severely eroded during the 2013 floods. It needed a lot of work. The majority of our time was spent over there. If you've been out there recently, it is vastly improved. It's a lot more solid and withstanding the use and abuse. It's a challenging section because it's in the shade. It never really dries out properly. The other section we worked on in the fall was the Coal Seam Trail, which is a very important connector trail that was also severely eroded in the floods. We armored it. We put in one of those cattle grates, so bikers don't have to go through the gate anymore. Those are very popular. We are also using the opportunity to teach people to build, how to build a trail right, that it needs to be maintained properly and regularly, that good trails don't fall from the sky. Someone has to build them. Giving back to the trails is a good thing. We're also teaching people tool safety, camaraderie, and teamwork. So overall, we are very happy with the results. We had a successful season, I think. A lot of smiling faces. I want to thank Bo Clark, the Trail Volunteer Program Lead with the department in particular, and Sam and Cameron on his team, as well as Chad Brotherton and Jared Roberts, supervisors. For next year, we're looking pretty much forward to doing the same. South Boulder needs a lot of work. The backlog is still substantial. So you will hear from us again. Thank you.
Thanks, Hans. And as to all of our volunteers, we appreciate the enormous amount of work that you do for us. Andre?
Yes. Thank you all. I just wanted to also appreciate last month's discussion, the great questions, a great presentation by staff, John Potter and Andy Pelster, and just really encouraged about the direction that agricultural leasing seems to be taking. I just had a couple of specific ideas of how to fix the weightings in particular, and it seems like we do have this rationale for weighting towards experience, and the rationale being that we want to minimize farm failures. And I think there's a better way to do this than relying so highly on experience, and that is make equipment requirements and financial ability more significant and decrease experience. Because if you have the equipment and you have the financial means, it's likely that somehow you have enough experience to have that equipment. For some reason, people don't generally go out there and buy tractors and balers with no farming experience. So I have a proposed weighting here, and I'm going to send it to each of you after the meeting, but to sort of change things to decrease the reliance that we have on experience, which tends to, in practice, exclude newer farmers. And that would be 50% of the weighting would be for supporting the management objectives of the city, including the agricultural resource management plan, 25% experience. And on this, I'd like to just comment that experience is more than just the number of years that you have in agriculture. It seems like if you're old, you get higher experience, looking at the matrix of previous decisions. If you're older, you get more experience points, and if you're younger, you don't have it, regardless of the breadth or depth of your farming experience, education, and so on. And so I would like to comment that experience is more than just years. And then I would say 10% equipment, equipment and a demonstrated ability to meet financial demands, and then 5% in terms of eligibility requirements for the disadvantaged business, and 5% in proximity, because I do think that proximity of farms to established operations does matter. It increases the likelihood that people will be able to respond quickly to emergencies, which we talked about last month, but it also means that you tend to have a more compact, and that can lead to a more regenerative type of operation where there's more proximity of labor to the operation. The second category I think that we need to fix, and I'm going to include this in the emails, is that if you look at the decisions in the most recent round of bidding, there seems to be a disconnect between the stated criteria and the way that those criteria are judged. And I just would remind, going through the county process, the county is very specific to all their bidders in the request for proposal that you have to, decisions can only be made based on information that's in the bid itself, and not on other information that might be just sort of floating around in the general knowledge. And I would say that's very important. And if you look at the examples that I'll send you, there's some, it seems like a lot of information is being left kind of out of the bids, and I would encourage that things do need to be sort of transparent and in the bid process. Thanks.
Thanks, Andre. Elena Zubalaki, then Kars Pustmuller. And you have 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you again. I'm going to begin here. Please do not feel guilty for my tears. Life is that beautiful, and without them, we forget how those ones' coats glowed under the full moon, and their gaze, love herself spreading her wings to touch that fine mist hanging in the mountain moonlight, while you sang your Creole walking song, little sun on your shoulders in harmony with their hooves and horns. Ecstasy of all this, and at midnight, 2 deaths ushered in with the dawn. Tears are the appropriate medicine for the day, and a life well lived in gratitude, grace, and a table laid with friends whose bodies are always touching that holy mountain again of our remembering. So that's a story from Jacob Springs Farm, where I live, with Andre Husny. And I am bringing it here because there's a quality to regenerative agriculture that really holds the stories of our land. And the reason that is because in order to be a regenerative farmer, you have to really understand complex systems. You have to know how to pay attention. You have to know how to think ahead and see what's coming. You have to know the interrelatedness between climate, between animals, between bigger issues in our world right now. This is the beauty of regenerative agriculture. It actually has the capacity to touch large issues like desertification, and drought and famine. It's really focused on healing the land. And so it's the role of farmer as healer is a substantial one. And there's only about, I think, less than 4% of the open space ag lands that are now dedicated to regenerative agriculture. So I think it's really important to give this land that's available. It's a beautiful program. I'm really glad that it exists. But to give it to these farmers who are practicing regenerative agriculture, because it really has the capacity to turn the tide of climate change. It's a healing modality, deeply healing. It really looks at what on a local scale is good for people, good for animals, good for the economy, good for community. Andre is an incredible farmer. He's been farming for over 30 years and has an understanding of farming not only from a local perspective, but he actually has sustainable businesses that are oriented in other parts of the world as well. So this kind of complexity of understanding is what makes a farmer that's really going to make a difference in our community. And I also want to talk specifically about the Lewis property that's coming up this winter, because it is very ideal for regenerative farming. Like, there needs to be contiguous land in order to do regenerative farming well. In our situation, we don't have a huge amount of land, and so we end up spending a lot of time and labor moving animals around to other pieces of property. So there's like an opportunity here on the Lewis property to really support a regenerative farmer. And the other thing about regenerative farming is it's like, now is the time. Like once you get going with a regenerative project, it's exponential in the capacity to have influence, both on that piece of land and then also in a more integrated system kind of way. Also, with the Lewis piece of property, there is housing, which is also a factor in regenerative farming, because there's more work that's being done with one's own hands, so it actually requires more direct labor. It's a more direct relationship with the land. So the fact that there is housing on that property also makes it ideal for potentially having a regenerative farm on that piece of land. Access to water as well, with having multiple animals, is also a benefit of that particular piece of land. Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elena.
Have a beautiful night.
You too. And cars, and one more.
Hi, everybody. I'm Cars Mueller, 383 Jasper Drive in Lyons. I was a member of the Prairie Dog Working Group, as you know. I believe that the options for the values exercise and other online materials about the expedited plan for prairie dogs on irrigated ag lands are biased towards privately owned ranching farming interests. These irrigated ag lands are publicly owned lands purchased with taxpayer dollars, and we need to always keep that in mind. There should be more inclusion in the process of the benefits of these ag lands to the public, including the importance of prairie dog conservation, which was the overall working group goal, the use of non-lethal methods to manage prairie dogs, which was a key working group basic principle, and other uses compatible with prairie dog occupancy. It seems to me like the expedited process has been solely created to consider lethal management on these lands. As such, it dismisses and devalues the 2 years of intense and difficult efforts of the working group, as well as the approximately $170,000 the city paid for that project. It is particularly concerning because the expedited process is taking place before OSMP has had a chance to implement the working group's non-lethal recommendations, some of which were developed specifically to help resolve conflicts on irrigated lands. OSMP should implement and exhaust all appropriate non-lethal working group recommendations on ag lands experiencing the most conflicts to determine their effectiveness in diminishing the conflicts prior to moving forward with any lethal options. Increase relocations and increase passive relocations, install more barriers, et cetera. But also, it's extremely important to focus resources on the implementation of the working group's economic recommendations. Your committee's argument for the expedited process was that the prairie dogs were not allowing OSBT to meet the city charter obligations. I've read the charter. It identifies several allowable uses, but does not establish current acreage or percentage goals for irrigated ag lands. I think the current goals should be revisited during the process and revised to reflect the need for multiple uses on these lands, including habitat for prairie dogs where they occur. So thanks for the opportunity to comment here, and I also will be submitting other comments to OSMP during their open comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Cars.
You're welcome.
And last is Lindsay Sterling Crank.
Hi, thank you. My name is Lindsay Sterling Crank, 210 Brook Road, Boulder, and we're still in the midst of this complex prairie dog management issue, and especially looking at these irrigated ag lands. And I was disappointed to not make the October 23rd open house. I had been invited to a Coexist Summit in Montana, where this awesome group of scientists and ranchers and producers and conservationists all got together to look at issues on the lands and how to keep working lands and public lands and ag lands producing with wildlife and coexisting. So we looked at bears, we looked at wolves, we looked at prairie dogs, and we looked at bison. And it's a great movement. And one of the biggest things that came out of that was that I found really encouraging was that the USDA, which has been some of our biggest, wildlife killers over the past in our country, is now looking at passing a $1.34 million bill for their non-lethal staff. And I just thought that was amazing and such a turn of the tide and something that we've all been working towards in the advocacy community for wildlife management and being progressive in the environment. And I just wanted to share with you that that's happening. And then coming back to Boulder and coming back into this issue where we're on an expedited process to evaluate lethal control for our prairie dogs was a bummer and was a setback. And I hope that whatever we do moving forward, that we can remember a couple key things. One of them was I spent some time on some of these irrigated ag lands this summer and just going out and looking at this beautiful land. And yes, it was pocketed with prairie dogs here and there, but it was kind of a small pocket, and the grass looked healthy, and it was producing. And some of these were hay fields, and those were also productive. And I just thought, are we really going to go change our policy that we're all so proud of for this $200 or $300 here? How can we actually work together to make that work so that these producers and these farmers and these crop growers can have some sort of stasis with wildlife on the lands too, and what can we do together? So I really hope that we can remember that the Prairie Dog Working Group's recommendations really looked at what kind of information, what kind of quantification, what kind of numbers and evaluation and planning do we need to do to make those coexistence tactics work, and that I also want to point out that the support for lethal control in our community was only after non-lethal didn't work. So we have to remember that we have to implement these coexistence and these non-lethal pieces before we get to this. It doesn't make sense to do the lethal piece. So that was really my bit. The other piece is, yes, I myself find it easier, even though I don't do this often, it would be easier to kill the prairie dogs than to deal with how much harder it is sometimes to make it work on both sides of the equation. But the data shows if we don't stabilize these populations, if they don't have infrastructure in place to limit their populations, they will never stabilize on their own. They'll always be up and down, so we'll always be doing lethal control. So we gotta coexist, we gotta do the non-lethal, and make it work for everybody. Thanks.
Thanks, Lindsay. So with that, we close public comment and turn to item 3 on the agenda, which is the agreement with the Boulder Rifle Club.
And with that, I'll introduce Tom Carr, City Attorney. While Tom's getting set up, I'll just remind the board that on a related but separate matter, we, staff for OS&P, will be compiling information as we know it, as it exists today regarding the expansion effort, and we will make sure that the board is updated as we get updated, and in a upcoming board packet, we will provide you the information that we know about and that we've participated in up to date for the expansion effort. But as we tried to indicate in the memo, this is a different issue that that Tom's been leading for many years, and but just in regards to this expansion effort, we will be getting back to you with more information on that.
Thanks, Dan.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me here tonight. As Dan said, this is a project I've been working on for 7 or 8 years, believe it or not. There has been a long-term dispute between the City of Boulder and the Boulder Rifle Club, and this agreement is a culmination of years of work to try to resolve that dispute. The primary purpose for my being here, for my working on this agreement, is to obtain access to the Boulder Rifle Club for the Boulder Police Department and the Open Space Rangers to train. I'll go through the history a little bit, but the goal would be, as you probably know, every officer in the Boulder Police Department has to annually be qualified to use a rifle. And we also have a SWAT team that has to train. Right now, they train down in Broomfield. So that means that every officer who trains has to be out of service for a full day. And so if something were to happen in Boulder, they would not be available. The Boulder Rifle Club is 10 minutes away. And so if they were training there, they would be able to respond to emergencies, would be a half day rather than a full day out of service. And the availability at Broomfield is getting more and more limited. There just aren't very many places where people shoot, and which is one of the reasons for the expansion that's going on, the plan. But that's a subject for another day. It should be clear that this agreement has nothing to do with the expansion. It's, as I said, I've been working on it, I think, for 8 years now. The expansion I learned about earlier this year. So let me tell you a little history. The Boulder Gun Club was founded in approximately 1899. There's records of it in 1899. There isn't a record of when it was founded, but it existed in 1899. It became the Boulder Rifle Club in 1923. The current site was the Boulder City Dump from 1935 until I think about 1965. The dump was previously at the site of Scott Carpenter Park. In the 30s, people started complaining that the dump was right along Arapahoe Road, which is the main entrance to the city, so they moved it north to get it out of the way. The first rifle range was built on the site by somebody called the group called the Boulder Boys in 1950. The Rifle Club took it over in 76. So as early as the 70s, the city police department was training there. And on and off, there were disputes to the club. There was some strong personalities on both sides of the equation. I myself was thrown out of the club once as part of the negotiations. In 2005, the club revoked the police department's right to use the club. And so the police actually built a pistol range in the basement of the public safety building, and they train there. But they don't have a place to train on city property with rifles. So we've been talking back and forth about how we solve these problems and get the police back. It should be clear that we're talking about city land here. It is not open space land. The reason why you're graced with my presence tonight is because no department wants this land. As I said, it was a dump for 30 years. I've tried to give it to Public Works. I've tried open space parks. Nobody wants it. So the city attorney ends up handling it because no one else will deal with it. The land at issue, and I'll show you some maps in a second, the land at issue is south of the club. They have an access easement across city land, which we would make permanent, and they use a bit of land for parking. And let me show you some maps that'll help make that clear. So this is in your packet. It's from the packet material that approved the Lappin purchase. So as you can see, and I'll use a little pointer here. This is the Lappin property, which is open space property the city acquired in 2011. I'm not exactly sure.
10, yeah.
What?
10, but
Yeah.
give it to you.
Yeah, so this is the Rifle Club as it exists today. This whole area here is formerly the city dump. This area up here is open space land. This area here is Boulder Rifle Club property that is covered by a county open space easement. The county is negotiating with the club to allow expansion of the club this way onto that easement. Again, this arrangement has nothing to do with that, but that's, when they talk about the expansion, this is the area they're talking about. So this is from a survey, and as you can see, this is the Lappin property over here. You can see the pond up there, and on the aerial, you can see the pond there. So it's just to orient yourselves. So this line is an easement that's owned by the Rifle Club that burdens the current open space property. If this is a recording information at the Boulder County Register, and there's something in here that says this is an old road. To my knowledge, it has never been used, but it is a recorded easement. It for some reason, did not come up at the time of the Lappin purchase. We learned about it when we started talking about this, and they were threatening to build a road on it. Again, some strong personalities at the time. So the city has an interest, although not a tremendously great interest, in extinguishing this easement so it can never in the future be used to interfere with the open space uses of that land. This is the area. So as I said, this is all the former city dump that's currently City of Boulder property. The City of Boulder property line is approximately there. So you can see they have a parking lot right in there and up there. So we have on and off for the last 20 or 30 years given them easements to use this area. This is a close-up of the area. This is the land that would be conveyed to them by quitclaim deed for them to have their parking lot and access to their 200-yard range. So as a summary of the transaction, the city quitclaims the edge parcel, which is what I call this, the edge parcel, to the Rifle Club. The club quitclaims the easement over the Lappin property of the city. The club pays the city $30,000. And let me sort of explain where the $30,000 came from. So if you look at this map, about 700 yards from here, the Hidden Valley Trail crosses north. And so we had originally demanded, without having seen the property, that they build a bigger berm to prevent any possible intrusion on the Hidden Valley Trail. Well, Dan and I went out there and actually climbed that berm. There's two problems. One, it's pretty high. The only way to get a bullet over that would be to shoot straight up in the air, and there's no way you can make a berm that would be high enough so someone couldn't shoot up in the air. And secondly, to build a higher berm, you have to, of course, expand the base, which would mean intruding onto open space property, which is something we weren't interested in discussing. So we discussed with them ways in which we could mitigate potential risks to safety to open space visitors. And the challenge is that people don't always stay on trails and can wander off. And sometimes, for reasons that are beyond me, they're attracted by the sound of gunshots. So people have occasionally wandered off the trail towards the Rifle Club. No one has ever been hurt or even at risk as far as I know. So we talked about ways in which we could mitigate those damages, with perhaps those risks with perhaps better signage, a better fence or whatever, without using open space funds. So in return for saying, yeah, there's really no point in building a higher berm, and we don't want one anyway because it would intrude on open space land, they agreed to give us $30,000. And the way we wrote in the agreement was to mitigate impacts or to increase safety. So the idea was better signage, perhaps a better fence, not using open space funds for that purpose. As I understand, Dan can explain better, there's in the North Trail Study area plan, there is a plan to move the Hidden Valley Trail north anyway, so there may not be a good use for funds to do it, and maybe you could do something else with that money. You'd have to think about that. And also, if they go forward with the expansion, they'd have there are rules about how close a trail can be. That trail is too close for the expansion right now, so that trail would have to move to allow for the expansion if the county allows the expansion. So I'm not sure what you'd want to do with the money, but that's where the money came from, why the $30,000. It's not really a payment for the property or trying to even out the amounts. This is, as I said, old dump land. I have walked it. I'll tell you that there are car parts and parts of mattresses extruding from the land. I don't know that it has a lot of value. That currently on the southern portion over here, they're building an emergency tower for the new radio communications network that the public safety agencies are building. So, and this is a very steep slope. So the only flat area is up here, which is, of course, their land. So there's a strip of flat land here, and then this drops off. So I brought this to City Council, to the City Council Agenda Committee, and asked them to schedule approval of the agreements. They asked me to bring it to you to get your feedback on it. So that's the reason I'm here, and I would appreciate your comments and any motion to support or oppose before I bring it back to council. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Any clarifying questions before we go to the public?
So I missed the reason for the $30,000.
It was in place of us requiring them to build a bigger berm.
So it was just a number picked out of the air?
Yeah. There was really no relationship. There's no, it's hard to say that this land has any value at all for anything.
For a parking lot, obviously.
No, actually.
Not really a parking lot.
Because I was actually trying to do a deal with one of the mobile home parks to park recreational vehicles there so we could expand the library lot. And we looked at it and decided that the county would never allow us to put a parking lot there. So I'm not sure it has any use whatsoever for anything. And as I said, Karen, it's not flat. It's very steep. It goes down to a pit, and you'd have.
They're planning to put a parking lot there.
No, their parking lot is up on the edge. So that's the parking lot there. There's a very narrow band of flat land, and it goes down. The police actually use the pit to blow things up. So occasionally they explode stuff down there. And I should mention that Deputy Chief Curtis Johnson from the Police Department is here if you have any questions about their needs, and Burton Stoner is here as well from the Open Space Rangers, who also will be training there.
So how big is the edge lot, and how big is the conservation easement on Lappin?
My recollection is that it's about it's about 200 feet by 40 feet, the edge property, and I do not have any idea how big the easement is on the Lappin property, but you can see it there.
The Lappin property is fee-owned by Open Space, that's 40 acres. And the conservation easement that the county holds is actually over the Rifle Club property itself, not over the Lappin property.
Right, but the easement that
we'd be acquiring.
Abandoning.
Oh, okay,
so,
I got you.
Is here.
Right.
So
I was just wondering how big that was.
It's a linear easement, and yeah, I don't see a measurement, Dave.
So it's only the purported old road?
Yeah, it is an access.
It's not the land between the property boundary and the edge of the easement?
No.
Okay.
No. It's a right to enter. So this part down here is a former road. It's a dirt path.
Right.
And so you could theoretically, what they threatened me with once was, so they come in right now over city property on this piece, this road here. We were refusing to give them another easement, so they threatened to build a road on the Lappin property, so they could go this way. And so we don't want that to happen, and that's not going to happen, but it seemed to me that there was a value in cleaning that up. Go ahead.
So, Tom, I've got a couple of questions.
Sure.
I am concerned that there are two major issues from my perspective related to the adjacent open space. One is safety, and it seems to me that the safety issue is a issue of mutual concern between the Rifle Club and the City of Boulder. The other issue is the experience of the visitor on open space. So for lack of a better term, the open space experience. And so I think we should separate those two. And this speaks to the safety issue. The $30,000 is a little concerning to me, because I don't know whether we looked at what the fencing requirements are, but I'm not sure that may be sufficient to, address the costs of whatever mitigation actually is determined. So that's one of the concerns. The other concern is is a little more problematic, and that is, what do you do with the open space experience, or the quality of, you know, the visitor experience there? And it just strikes me that the city should follow up this agreement, or it should be contained in this agreement, that the city will work with the Rifle Club on determining noise abatement protocols or solutions or something like that, because that is one of the key impacts on the open space property, in addition to the potential safety or risks. It's just the noise. And I think with the prospect of the expansion proposal, that noise factor is probably realistically going to increase. And so I'm just a little discomfited that noise itself is not addressed in this agreement, at least with language that says that, you know, there should be subsequent efforts by both parties to deal with or to rectify the noise impact on adjacent properties.
Yeah. So I agree, and I think the club would agree, that it's a mutual interest to promote safety, and their biggest concern is having people wander in from the north.
Right, right. And this addresses that, and we...
To some extent, yeah.
Yeah.
We can certainly strengthen the language in the agreement on that issue. The noise issue is I'm not an expert on the expansion. What I've read is that to get it approved, they have to do significant noise abatement on the new public rifle range that they're proposing. So the materials that I've seen suggest that it will be quieter than the current range. But the current range still produces a significant amount of noise. And as you well know, rifle shots carry.
Yes.
You can hear them clearly at the reservoir, which is over a mile away.
So moving the trail as one of the mitigation solutions doesn't really deal with the noise factor, because you can't move the trail far enough that it won't be a factor.
The challenge is, of course, that the range was there before the trail was. And so there aren't very many places where you can shoot in this county, and this is one of them that's been there for a long time. I think they would push back pretty hard on any attempt to get them to make their current range quieter. Their plan is to, so their current range is a membership range. They have like 800 members and a 10-year waiting list or 20-year waiting list. The proposal is for a public range that would be open and free to the public. But they intend to keep their membership range for their members without any change. So I can ask, but and maybe get some language about mutual attempts to mitigate noise impacts on open space. But that's a pretty heavy lift, considering the way that the sound of a rifle shot carries, particularly in areas like that where it's fairly flat.
Right. But so all I would assert is that, recognizing that the Rifle Club was there early on, so it's been about 100 years or more, so things have changed. And so it's not the edge of the city, it's not in a rural area anymore, it's basically, you know, in an urbanizing area, and it just strikes me that the Rifle Club, it should behoove the Rifle Club to try to address the noise impacts, both as a good neighbor as well as trying to realistically minimize its impacts. So I guess we'll see what the discussion is, but I think we ought to propose some additional language, either to this agreement or some recognition that there needs to be further conversations or further work on dealing with other impacts other than just the safety issue coming from open space.
Okay, got it.
Tom, I know we're not really here to discuss the expansion, but since you're here, we can take advantage of your expertise now. Something you had said about you can't have the rifle range within a certain distance of a trail made me wonder, who has priority? In other words, does that mean we could be forced to move the trail, or does it mean that if we insist on keeping the trail where it is, that is a barrier to the expansion? Or perhaps I misunderstood you altogether.
No, I think that's right. Bethany, do you know the answer? Bethany Collins has been following the trail, the expansion, so she may have more information than I do.
Hi, guys.
So the requirement is it has to be 1,320 feet away from a public right-of-way or a public trail. Or they have to do mitigation measures, engineering mitigation measures. In their current proposal, they're actually proposing to try to do both. So work with the city. Well, they identify that they thought it was the city's intention via the NTSA to be moving the Hidden Valley Trail at some point in time. We, in discussions with them, basically said, you're going to have to work with us to move that trail. Right now, it's about 600 to 700 feet away. So they're actually working to do both, to comply with both the engineered solution as well as the setback.
Good.
And can you just say a little bit more about engineered solution, what that means to them?
I only know what I've read in the application. So it has to do with putting roofing awnings over as far as any kickback from a rifle would, and I'm sure the law enforcement personnel can help more than I can. So it's berm, it's certain heights of walls, both the backdrop berm, the backdrop wall, as well as the side walls, as well as roofing over the actual where they're shooting from, that is far enough that any kind of kickback would not allow a bullet to go out of the range. They also, in adding to what you guys were discussing with Tom, they're actually proposing as part of the expansion to do noise abatement on 2 of the existing rifle ranges, outdoor rifle ranges. So they did do a noise study. If you've seen the city's comments to their application so far, the noise study was done from neighboring residential properties, mostly to the south, and we requested as part of this development application that they do noise studies from open space as well, and make sure to include in noise abatement that the solutions would also impact open space visitor experience.
That actually leads into a couple clarifying questions I have. We didn't talk about the south property owner. I'm just curious, who is it that is immediately south of this parcel? It's privately owned, correct?
I don't know, it's a commercial property, I believe.
Okay.
There is one large residential, it's identified as a George Granditz and Ann Miller on North 26th Street.
Okay. And maybe this is a question or two more for the deputy chief. I'm curious, is it correct to assume that police access on this facility would likely result in better community safety outcomes? And number 2, what is the status of lead being used out there or not being used out there?
So the first question I can definitely answer. Good evening, trustees. I'm Curtis Johnson with the police department. So for us, the issue is having a close place to train. So for example, right now, when we qualify with rifles, it's usually we go to a range for 1 or 2 days. And what that means for our officers is right now they have to commute to Broomfield and shoot and get back. They're out of service for typically at least 2.5 hours. At the rifle club, it's less than 10 minutes away from most places in town for us. So it's a matter of convenience and having the ability to train closer to where we work so our officers are more available, because we try to do all of that training on duty. So does that impact community safety? Absolutely. The modern patrol rifle is a fundamental piece of equipment that all of our officers are trained to use. It's important to us to be very accurate and capable with it, and having a place that we can train close by is absolutely beneficial, because if something happens while we're training at the rifle club, we are still within moments of the city limits.
Do you feel it makes the club itself a safer place?
Well, so the club has always tried to work with law enforcement and the military to support their operation. It's part of their fundamental goal is to be supportive of that, because they recognize as sport shooters themselves that having a well-trained police department is a benefit to everyone. Our presence at the club, I would like to say that we're not shooting rounds over the berm. Some of the mitigation efforts you've heard as far as roofing, typically they'll build a baffled roofing, so think angles that if a high shot were fired, those baffles knock the shot back down and keep it from going over a berm. Those also help deal with noise because they can contain some of that noise as it travels. As to your concern on noise, our shooting there will have a smaller impact on noise because most of our patrol rifles we shoot with suppressors, which greatly reduces the noise coming from our firearms. We do that because of our hearing, and if you can imagine us having to shoot a rifle like that at an enclosed space, like in the hallway of a building, we want to minimize the sound because it's impactful on us as well, and it's a health issue for our ears. So most of the time when we shoot rifles, they are suppressed, which is a significantly smaller amount of noise than an unsuppressed rifle. As to the lead piece, I don't know the rifle club's use of lead or not. We train primarily with lead-free ammunition because of our indoor range. All of our handgun shooting is lead-free because we don't want those contaminants in the air, and we don't want to have to deal with lead cleanup. I don't know where the rifle club stands on that.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So, Leah, has anyone signed up? So I'll open and close the public comment on this and come back to the board for further discussion. And I did want to make one quick point, which is the property to the east is also open space. Yes. Right. And so it's not a huge thing, but within the global agreement, the next to last, whereas clause perhaps should also reference open space property to the east, partly just as a matter of completeness, but also we should just keep in mind that as part of the North TSA, there's a potential, and I'll emphasize potential, trail on that property to the east that would sort of parallel the rifle club. It's only, the agreement is just that it's a potential trail. There's no agreement to actually commit to it, nor certainly any precise alignment. But it just as part of this broader discussion, we just ought to keep in mind that the property to the east is both open space and it's open space as to which we potentially will be putting a trail. So,
So in addition to that, Tom, I had a couple of questions on the language in the proposed agreement as it relates to the proposed motion language, and that is in number 2 on the second page of the agreement, after now therefore, it says that the club agrees to contribute up to $30,000 toward measures intended to enhance the safety of persons on the open space property. In the motion, the language says that the club agrees to pay to the city the amount of $30,000 to provide additional mitigation of impacts to open space. And it strikes me that those languages ought to be the same. It seems that the language in the agreement doesn't necessarily end up resulting in $30,000.
Yeah. So I wrote the language in the memo as I would like to see it, and I will work on if you approve the language in the memo as the motion, that's what language I will work to incorporate into the agreement. Because I'm not crazy about the language in the agreement, as you can tell, Dave. So I prefer the language in the motion.
And so my other comment would be, I am going to suggest some additional language for the agreement related to noise. And I think given what we've heard, both from the deputy chief and from Bethany, that it strikes me that the rifle club should not necessarily balk at that language, since in fact it looks like they're going to have to do some of those mitigation measures that we're concerned about in any event. And so
I never underestimate the ability of people to balk at things, Dave.
Okay. Well, we ought to give them an opportunity to balk then.
Okay.
And Tom, I assume you're comfortable taking a lot of this as sort of informal commentary or suggestions and don't need to wrap it all into a motion. I just want to confirm that.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah.
This will ultimately go to the city council, and
Yes.
this is largely a recommendation.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think also the record should reflect that I don't think the board is in opposition at all to the use of the rifle club by the city police department or the open space rangers. In fact, we're very supportive of that. And so the conversation on, some of the particulars should not be interpreted as opposition to the city's ability to have its law enforcement officers use that facility.
Yep.
And I would just say, in terms of the narrow issue that you're presenting for our recommendation, I'll be supportive of this, and I think it's fine. There obviously is a broader issue regarding the expansion that isn't, for today, but I think we will be very interested to, communicate with staff to understand what feedback is proposed to be provided to the county and to make sure that, the public has a chance to speak to that and that, we get a chance to speak to that because, there are significant open space concerns about the broader issue, but for another day.
And I would note the obvious that even though county is going to be approving the expansion, all the land around this is city-managed property or open space. And so I would just hope that our ability to participate in that process with the county would maybe be strengthened, recognizing that we've got all the surrounding land.
I have a couple of other questions on page 5 of the agenda item, which is the second page of the agreement. Number 1 says the city shall sell, transfer, and convey to the club. And I'm not an attorney, as you know. So to me, selling means you give people money for something in return, right?
Yeah, it recites $1, I think. So that we have the quitclaim deed as part of the agenda item.
Right.
And you can see it, it's I
on
believe.
page 14 of the.
Yeah, page 14.
And that says for the consideration of under $500.
Yep.
So my naive perception is that legal agreements are supposed to be pretty tight. And I find this all very confusing because the quitclaim deed says under $500.
I think we're talking about two different things. The quitclaim deed is they give up their easement over the Lappin property.
No, they're both quitclaim deeds.
Yeah, but I think maybe I'm.
14 is, I think, the Lappin one, but.
Oh, that's
Page 14 is the quitclaim deed on the easement on the Lappin property. Then there's the separate issue about.
And did I not include that one?
So page 14 of our attachment is the quitclaim deed for Lappin, and then
There
the.
is no other.
Yeah, there is another one, though. It's a similar quitclaim deed for the
Okay.
city's edge park.
So I assume, based on what you said previously, you're going to delete the up to 30,000 and just make that 30,000.
Yeah.
And all the other references to numbers will somehow add up to 30,000?
No. The $30,000 is a separate consideration as part, that's consideration for the global agreement. The consideration for the transfer property is really the swap of the easement for the edge parcel. That's the.
So there's no money involved in it?
There is no money involved. The less than $500 is a legal requirement. You have to use a more formal process if it's over $500. So when you say it's less than $500, you can use the simple quitclaim deed.
It can be zero.
Well, yeah, you wouldn't want to say, you'd never say zero, but yeah, it can be zero because the consideration is actually part of, it's recited in the global agreement, and the consideration really is a swap of the two properties.
Okay. And then, number 3, it says the city and OSMP and the club agree to meet and confer about ways of increasing public safety.
Yes.
With no guaranteed outcome or any agreement to have an outcome about anything except to meet and confer.
Yep.
I'll say I'm enthusiastic about supporting it. It strikes me as repairing relationships between our police officers and our local range makes a lot of sense to me on many levels. Like my co-trustees, I'm concerned about the two impacts that do leave the property. Those are noise and lead. I think lead is more of a discussion for expansion in the future because the expense of the ammunition relates to total amount of shots fired and therefore noise. I'll be fascinated by that discussion in the future, but I think I see the picture of where this is going and understand why it's being undertaken.
So may I also ask about number 6 on that same page?
Yep.
And this may be boilerplate language, I don't know that, but it says replaces all prior written and oral understandings. It's the entire agreement.
Yes.
That makes it sound like this agreement is really clearly wrapped up and nailed down.
There's several reasons for this language. One, we have a series of easements and other agreements that go back years with the club. Clarifies that they're all gone, that this is the relationship between the club. There's going to be a separate range use agreement that's not part of this agreement and not contingent on this agreement, but that's the police and open space rangers use. This is also called an integration clause. So under the law, if you don't have an integration clause, someone can come forward and say, this other document was part of the agreement. So you put an integration clause in all written agreements to say that, to make it clear that there's no other documents that someone can bring forward that's part of this agreement. And so this agreement recites all the other agreements that are part of it, and it disclaims that there's any other non-written or something that's not included in this document.
Okay, so the meet and confer language in number 3 is something that you're okay with if nothing comes of those meeting and conferences?
Well, I would prefer that something comes from those meeting and conferences. The meet and confer language is an agreement to talk, not an agreement to agree. And so we may not agree, but as Dave noted, both parties have an interest in the safety of the open space visitors.
Okay.
And so they're the ones who suggested, and it's taken us a long time to get them to agree to talk to us or for us to want to talk to them. So that may seem like incredibly weak language, but it's a big step forward. And frankly, they like the open space folks that they met when we went out there. And so
did they meet Burton?
Burton, were you with us that day? Burton was with us.
Must have been someone else other than me.
Well, no, it was Dan too. And so by talking to them, we broke down a lot of the barriers that had existed between. As I said, the prior president threw me off the property one time when I went out. I went out with Jim Reeder to talk to him, and or was it?
Well, you took Reeder.
Yeah.
They kept Reeder and threw you.
It was a prior purchasing agent, and so to get to the point where they're willing to sit down and work with us, and as Curtis said, they have an interest in public safety and in supporting the police department. They want to do that. The county sheriffs have shot there all this time, and part of the problem was, frankly, each party was trying to use the leverage we had over the other to get what we wanted. So we knew that they needed our land to get to their club. They knew that we wanted to use their club for rifles for training our officers. So we went back and forth and basically, like fools, stood in corners and didn't get this done. So over the years, we have broken down those barriers and gotten to the point where we're not standing in corners. We're going to cooperate, and we're going to get the police back in there, and the Rangers as well, who were not an issue when we did this before. They weren't training there, but they are. Hopefully, they will be soon.
So this is basically to cement the road access and the access for the target practice, the shooting.
Yes.
And tell me if I'm wrong, it removes their ability to use a road through open space property as a cudgel and leveraging tool and simplifies everything.
Exactly. But most important, something that Hal noted, it broke down, what this does is it repairs the relationship between the parties. And I think, Karen, you noted that as well. And that is the most important thing to me, to get this done. And really, it will not surprise you that many of our police officers are members of the Boulder Rifle Club. So I hear this from two different directions. I talk to their lawyer, and then I hear from our armorer and one of our deputy chiefs and one of our commanders, who are all members there, who are building this relationship. So their belief is that this will help, will fix things, and we will be able to get our police back in there and accomplish our public safety goal.
Okay, so I think it sounds like we're ready for a motion.
Before we do that, I would like to offer some additional language for the board's consideration before actually we convey that in a more formal fashion to Tom. And that is, I would like to put some language in regarding the noise issue, and not so much that it has to be resolved by this agreement, but it is part of the agreement to meet and confer. So there's more specificity about what the meeting and conferencing actually entails. And the language would be, this agreement does not address the sound of shots and the impacts on open space lands and visitors from the club. Sounds of shots and noise will be addressed in a separate agreement, or I was going to say, or in the decision package if approved for expansion of the club. So I'm wondering if the board is comfortable with some kind of language like that regarding, okay, we agree on, the safety issue, but we think there's still some remaining issues that need to be addressed and hopefully resolved.
Dave, would it be similar to try to put that into 3, where it says meet and confer about ways and means of increasing public safety and addressing noise issues?
I would be comfortable with that.
Tom, since this would be an amendment to the agreement, are you comfortable taking that as a suggestion from the board?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Good.
One more clarifying question. When it says approve a series of agreements, it's hard for me to understand. I mean, I'm looking at one, which I know, but what is it?
So the global agreement also references the 2 quitclaim deeds.
Okay, so that's what it's referencing.
Yeah.
Okay. So are you comfortable that the conversation we just had with Tom's agreement to work on the language in the agreement means we can go back to the simplified motion, since the noise comment you're proposing to address would now be built into the agreement
Are you
itself?
okay with that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, all right.
Then yes.
All right, great.
I move.
Okay.
I move that the Open Space Board, I move that the Open Space Board recommend that the Boulder City Council approves a series of agreements with the Boulder Rifle Club, including an agreement to terminate an easement over the Lappin property, as well as to pay to the city the amount of $30,000 to provide additional mitigation of impacts to open space users.
Okay, we have a second?
I'll second.
Okay. All in favor? All right, great. Well, thank you, Tom.
Very much. I appreciate
Thanks, Tom.
Your consideration.
And if you feel that working on something for 7 or 8 years is too long, you're welcome to stay for the next item.
Actually, the last time it was brought was before my time.
Decades.
All right. So that then takes us, and thank you, everyone. That takes us to item 4, the Shanahan purchase.
Yeah, and with that, we're going to invite Luke McKay up from our Real Estate Services Work Group, and Bethany here from that same work group is here as well. And while Luke's getting set up, I'll just make note of a few things for the members of the public that are here or that may be watching. I believe all of you had the opportunity to go out and walk the property over the last couple of weeks with our staff, and so you know what an important piece of this property is. And I'll also just make mention of the fact that our Real Estate Services Work Group, we're all relatively new to the department. We all came on in the past 4 or 5 years together, and it's just one of those work groups that sort of the neighborhood grew up, moved out, and a new crop of neighbors moved in, and that's sort of how the Real Estate Services Work Group has formed. And when we came on, we were looking at a series of evaluating what properties we felt were most important to the department, and over the next 4 or 5 years, what are our goals and priorities? And I've shared those with the board in the past, and of course, Shanahan was always sort of one of those that was at the top of the list, along with the other historic ranches that were yet not totally protected, including Boulder Valley Farm, Lippincott Ranch, and now the opportunity to bring that last historic ranch under our fold is something that I know is personally exciting to a number of us in the department who have worked on this property for many, many years, and those newcomers that sort of validated our past work and are excited to bring this to fruition. So with that, I'll introduce Luke McKay.
Great. Thanks, Dan. So for tonight's presentation on the Shanahan Ranch acquisition, I'm going to break it down into 2 parts. I'll begin by talking about what we're acquiring, or what we're trying to acquire, which will include a brief overview of the property and some history of Shanahan Ranch as well, followed by a discussion of why we're recommending that we acquire it. I'll then wrap up by providing some of the details of the purchase and the recommended motion language. So Shanahan Ranch is approximately 179 acres located at 1019 South Foothills Highway. It's bordered by the Devil's Thumb and Shanahan Ridge neighborhoods to the north and west, State Highway 93 to the east, and OS&P fee and conservation easement lands to the south. The property includes 1 1/4 shares in South Boulder and Bear Creek Ditch, one of the most senior and therefore high yielding and valuable water rights on South Boulder Creek, as well as 3 ponds. The property also has a severed mineral estate. Generally speaking, the minerals under the east half of the ranch are owned by the Colorado State Land Board, while the minerals under the west half of the property are owned by the city and the Shanahans. And I'll provide a little bit more detail on that in a little bit. And then also the property includes a ranch headquarters area. It includes a single family home and 5 agricultural outbuildings, which are in about the 5-acre area outlined in purple there on the map in front of you. So Shanahan Ranch was homesteaded in 1863 by the owner's great-grandfather, and really has become a fixture in the community that has grown around it since then. In 1967, it was identified as a priority for preservation in the city's first ever acquisition plan, and has remained a priority ever since. In 1985, as part of a larger effort to prevent the development of a golf course and housing complex on Shanahan Ranch and what is now the Dover Blacker and Boulder Greens Venture open space properties, the city acquired 2 development rights agreements from the Shanahan family, which extinguished 9 of the 11 development rights associated with the property. At that time, the city also acquired from the family 1 1/2 shares in South Boulder and Bear Creek Ditch and their mineral rights except for their oil and gas interests. And although the purchase of the development rights agreements helped prevent the development of the golf course and the housing complex, they did not fully protect the property from development, nor do they fully preserve the property's conservation or open space charter purposes that would be codified a year later in our charter in 1986. Oops. And so since 1985, the fee acquisition of the property, or all the sticks or property rights we did not acquire in 1985 through the development rights agreements, has remained a high priority for the city. In 2008, we almost acquired the property and were under contract to do so, but had to back out of the purchase due to the rising global financial crisis and uncertainty over OS&P funding. And since 2008, the property has been listed for sale several times, and we've been in on and off again negotiations with the Shanahan family. And so, considering that history, it's really staff's opinion that this is the city's final opportunity to acquire and preserve this property. It's often said that the opportunities to acquire and protect land that have been in the same generation for same family for generations are often once in a generation opportunities, and it's rare to get a second opportunity with the same generation in our experience. So that's some background on Shanahan Ranch and what we're trying to acquire, and so I'll spend the rest of my time speaking about why we're recommending that the city acquire it and why it's remained such a high priority all these years. And the primary reason this acquisition is a high priority is that it will enable us to preserve, steward, and manage a remarkable suite of conservation purposes and resources, not only on Shanahan Ranch, but given its size, location, and the interconnectedness of those open space charter purposes and resources, we will be able to, better preserve, better protect, better steward, and better manage charter purposes and resources on surrounding OSMP lands as well. So for example, this property supports native tallgrass prairie that's considered imperiled on a global and state levels by the Colorado Natural Heritage Program. And these grasslands are classified as having very high biodiversity significance, providing important habitat for ground nesting birds, rare butterflies, and winter habitat for mule deer. However, this acquisition will not only protect the tallgrass prairie on Shanahan Ranch, but better enable staff to steward and manage these grasslands on a landscape scale. And so the map in front of you shows the Colorado Tallgrass Prairie State Natural Area, including its current boundaries and proposed additions. And based on feedback from the Colorado Natural Heritage Program, Shanahan Ranch is a likely addition to the state natural area. And again, given its size, location, and infrastructure, it will provide important buffer habitat to these critical grasslands, create an opportunity to expand these once extensive plant communities, and provide a hub for the agricultural management of the state natural area. And similarly, the ranch's irrigated lower elevation grasslands and ponds provide potential opportunities to manage for important species like northern leopard frogs, which were found on one of the property's ponds, and bobolinks as part of the department's larger management efforts for protecting these species. So this acquisition will also permanently protect and preserve a property that's commonly referred to as the gateway to the city, and help the city protect the viewshed and scenic areas not only west of State Highway 93, but from our extensive network of trails and nearby open space in this area. The property is also one of Boulder County's oldest ranches and is irrigated with one of the most senior water rights on South Boulder Creek with an appropriation date of 1862. But really what makes this property especially unique is its size, location, and existing infrastructure, including a residence that the department's agricultural resource staff envisions serving as a headquarters for future agricultural operations. And having a headquarters in this area is key for not only better ensuring continued agricultural use on the property in the future, but also continued agricultural use on other OSMP agricultural properties, including lands in the Tallgrass Prairie State Natural Area. And lastly, we just wanted to highlight that since Shanahan Ranch has been privately owned and the development rights agreements did not grant to the city rights to provide public access, there are no planned trails, trail connections, or access points for this property. However, the property is within the West Trail Study Area, and given the proximity to existing trails, trailheads, and access points, and recommendations outlined in the West TSA and the Visitor Master Plan, there is the potential, and want to emphasize potential, to offer passive recreational opportunities on this property in the future. So those are the primary charter purposes and resources we're protecting with this acquisition. And one question that we've gotten a lot over the years is, don't the development rights agreements already protect these purposes and resources and accomplish the city's stewardship and management goals for not only this property but the surrounding area? And the answer, frankly, is no. And here are some of the reasons why. The property can be subdivided into as many as 3 parcels, which would not only impact the viability of future agricultural operations, but also fragment the property's unique flora and fauna, wildlife habitats, and fragile ecosystems. The agreements allow for the development of a currently undeveloped residential site and the redevelopment or relocation of the existing residents, as well as an unlimited amount of agricultural structures, which would significantly impact all the property's charter purposes and resources, but in particular its scenic areas, vistas, and aesthetic values. And just for reference, the undeveloped residential site on the property is marked by the yellow circle on the southeast corner of the property. Next, the water rights can be sold, are not tied to the property and can be sold off, and if acquired for uses other than irrigation would likely dry up the ranch in perpetuity. The drying up of the property would impact all the property's charter purposes and resources, but also could impact the underlying hydrology in this area, and by extension, charter purposes and resources on nearby open space. Under the development rights agreements, the Shanahans retain their oil and gas rights on the west half of the property, which can be developed or leased. And finally, we didn't really emphasize this in the memo, but we thought it was important to stress. There's no requirement or obligation in the development rights agreements for the property owner to keep the ranch in agricultural production or managed a particular way. And so, we as a community have been fortunate that the Shanahan family has demonstrated a land ethic spanning, many decades that's in line with OSMP's land ethic and values and management practices. But the development rights agreements do not guarantee that a future owner will share that same ethic and values and keep the property in agriculture. So in closing, those are the reasons why we're recommending this acquisition. To recap, we're recommending that we acquire the 179 acres of land, the appurtenant water and mineral rights, and the ranch headquarters, or to put it another way, everything that the city did not acquire through the 1985 development rights agreements, for a purchase price of $8 million. As discussed in the memo, the purchase will likely include a leaseback to Lynn Shanahan, one of the owners who has lived on and managed the ranch with his wife Sandy since 1994, to help ensure the uninterrupted and ongoing agricultural management of the property in the short term, and provide some time for the department to develop a resource assessment and management recommendations. And Dan touched on this a little bit. One final point before going to clarifying questions is, we realize that this is an expensive acquisition and that if we close, we'll have spent down most of the carryover funding in our acquisition CIP that has enabled the department to make strategic and high priority acquisitions during a period of time where our annual budget allocations to that CIP have been decreasing. But with that said, for the reasons that we discussed in the memo and that I've gone over tonight in my presentation, we consider this an opportunity, we consider this opportunity to acquire Shanahan Ranch to not only be strategic, but to be of the highest priority and worthy of the public's investment with these remaining acquisition funds. And so with that, I can take any clarifying questions.
Anything that didn't already get covered, or field trips?
So Luke, is it a cash payment?
It is, yep. It's a straight cash purchase.
Leah, has anyone signed up on this one? Okay, then I will open and close the public comment on this acquisition. Just say, I certainly support this. Like many people here, I was around and following open space issues back in 2008. I'm glad this one came back around a second time. In some ways, I like this deal better. It doesn't have the life estate, and with inflation and general increase in value of real estate, the change in price relative to the 2008 deal, I think is certainly fair, and so I'll certainly support this.
And I will too. And I especially want to thank Lynn Shanahan and his family for their decades of managing this land in a way that preserves the incredible natural resources that you've already described, Luke, that are important not only for this specific location, but significant for our natural resource values here in Colorado and globally.
And to help us eat a lot of tall oak grass.
Right. Yeah, the relationship of this ranch property to the whole contiguous area that goes to the south and the west, and our ability to manage those lands is really important.
Yeah.
I certainly plan to support this too. I mean, this is, for somebody new to the trustees, to see something like this is really exciting. Having only been out in small groups, one thing I did want to express personally when we do a resource evaluation pursuant to the charter on scenic areas and vistas it's my own personal opinion, but I think a lot of citizens would agree, that the power lines running across that property really impede what could be one of the most gold-plated views in all of Boulder. And I think down the road, we should look at helping underground those for scenic purposes. And so I just wanted to, next time you drive by, see if you note what I see. In any case, I'm very enthusiastic supporter here.
So you're not just talking about power lines along the road?
It goes directly out across the property to Lynn's home, and you know, it's just, it takes away from its feeling of open space.
I'm going to support this with enthusiasm as well. A couple of things. One, I think in the history of the open space program, there are a few properties that can actually be called jewels of the program, and this is certainly one. For all the reasons that you articulated, Luke, it is really an important and significant addition to the city's open space program. One of the things that is important to me personally is that it adds the contiguity of lands for, the state natural area. The Tallgrass Prairie Natural Area was first designated by the state in the late 1980s, and as you can't tell from but from the map, there are kind of seven. The original natural area was 7 discontinuous parcels, and the purchase of the Shanahan Ranch, as your one map showed, starts to bring some of those parcels together, so that the extent of the natural area for a whole bunch of ecological reasons is greatly magnified, and I think that's a real benefit. So.
All I'll add is that this is sort of the crowning jewel in a series of jewels that the property and acquisitions real estate folks have gotten for us. And so we don't know what is next, but this is a terrific run in the last few years for your group. And all I can say is bravo. I mean, when you mentioned most of them, Dan, but that's quite a series of properties, so bravo.
Who wants to do the honors?
I'll be glad to move that the Open Space Board of Trustees recommend to the City Council that they approve the purchase of approximately 179 acres of land, a residence, garage, and associated outbuildings, and the appurtenant mineral and water rights, including 1 1/4 shares of South Boulder and Bear Creek Ditch, located at 1019 South Foothills Highway from Shanahan Ranch LLC, for $8 million for open space and mountain parks purposes.
I'll second.
Okay, all in favor? Okay. All right.
Can we all be seconders on this?
And thank you for your persistence to all of the staff over the years, and thank you also to the Shanahans.
Thanks, Luke.
All right, so that concludes item 4. We now turn to item 5 on the agenda, matters from the department.
Before John comes up to address I just want to make note of a less crowning achievement, but significant nonetheless. Today, our open space rangers have officially moved out of this 10 shed at the yards and are now located out at the North Ranch home at Cherryville. So it was a long time in coming and trying to find an inspiring, workable place for our rangers to be at, and we think we did that by making some needed upgrades to the Cherryville North Ranch home, and it's going to be a great home for our rangers for many years to come. And so I just want to congratulate the rangers to moving into the new home, and if you're looking for them, they're out at Cherryville. And with that, I'll turn things over to John Potter.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Dan. Mark Gershman couldn't be here tonight, so I will provide you a brief update on the management review of irrigated fields with high prairie dog occupancy that you and council directed us to do earlier this year. We opened the first window of public engagement on October 23rd with a community meeting at the OSMP offices at 55th Street. 80 members of the public were in attendance at that meeting, as you know, because you were there as well, so thank you. The three purposes of that meeting was to, one, establish a shared understanding of key aspects of the current situation. Secondly, to find out if additional important elements were there that we should be considering while staying within the council's direction and the expedited time frame. And thirdly, to get initial ideas from the public on ways to improve the situation. Staff made presentations on the OSMP Prairie Dog Management Framework and practices, on local regulations that affect how we manage prairie dogs, and also the current situation of prairie dogs on agricultural lands. There were opportunities for clarifying questions that extended into a poster session, which followed the staff presentation and a group Q&A session. Several questions focused on specific prairie dog and irrigated land management practices, but also there were a few questions around gaining a better understanding about how the city measures relative value, importance, and priority of prairie dogs and irrigated agricultural land. Asked what considerations that staff may have missed. The most common response among participants at the community meeting was a desire for a greater focus on the effects of management goals on neighboring property owners. Participants shared many ideas about how they would improve the situation. Common themes were more aggressive on-the-ground management, specifically for OSMP to use or allow lethal control. Other suggestions included continuing relocations and practices like contraceptives, changes to agricultural management objectives, and the introduction of black-footed ferrets. Some participants suggested policy changes, such as amendments to the Wildlife Protection Ordinance or changes to aspects of the grassland ecosystem management plan. The community meeting, about half of the room participated in a values exercise that identified what is most important to them. The top three values at the community meeting being farming and ranching on OSMP land, the role of grassland, plants, and soil in capturing carbon from the atmosphere, and the management goals of neighboring property owners. All of the meeting information was put online on the OSMP project website with a link to the Be Heard Boulder Active Projects website, which is beheardboulder.org. Online responses that we've received on that site have been similar with regards to the integration of lethal control into a broad range of other practices. In addition, there have been a number of suggestions to stop leasing land for agricultural production as a way to avoid lethal control. So we're seeing a range of feedback on the online. As of this morning, 132 people have participated in an online version of the values exercise, and the top three values that we're hearing back so far are farming and ranching on OSMP lands, ability of grassland, plants, and soil in capturing carbon, and animals dependent on prairie dogs. However, there were about 87 other responses, and we haven't had a chance to go through those yet and kind of parse out what the other ideas that the online participants have had. This first engagement window closes tonight at midnight, so anybody seeing this has a chance still to weigh in before we bring that information all together and digest it. The purpose of all this engagement was to provide staff with the benefit of community members' ideas as it moved into developing, evaluating, and putting together preliminary options to address the problem as expressed by you and council. These initial thoughts on options will be shared with OSBT and the public at the January 8th OSBT meeting, when a second window of engagement will open. Staff will conduct a study session with the board at the February 12th meeting and bring final recommendations for consideration to the March 11th meeting. So that's all I have for you tonight. But if you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Thank you, John. Any questions for John?
I have a quick question. It goes to your summary of comments. I was really surprised that I didn't see more members of the Prairie Dog Working Group or Prairie Dog Advocates at the October 23rd meeting. And I'm wondering if you can relate to us whether those people were notified of the meeting and how the outreach was done, whether that was a factor, or whether you have any understanding of why, given that there was a special annual update of the Prairie Dog Working Group recommendations that was given at the beginning of the meeting, and that constituency wasn't there.
Yeah, we did. We've sent out about 35 communications on this issue over the course of the past month, including stakeholder emails to all the Prairie Dog Working Group, as well as lessees and everyone kind of on our lists. Also, Facebook, Twitter. There was an article in the paper. It was pretty well out there. So I'm not sure exactly how to understand the range of participation at the community meeting. However, I will say that the online participation has been very broad in its in the feedback that we've received, much more so than my sense of the community meeting. So we have had good input and good feedback on those same questions from a broad range of the community.
And Lindsay did explain that she was obviously well aware of the meeting, but had a competing commitment, and we got that.
Yep.
Any other? Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, John.
Thanks, John. All right, our second matters from the department is going to be a report on our undesignated trail monitoring, as well as a program overview. And with that, I'm going to invite Jake Engelman, our trail research coordinator, and Hillary Deese, our trail stewardship program lead, up to join us to lead us in the presentation. It's narrow.
Hello, I'm Jake Engelman. I'm the Trail Research Coordinator for Open Space. I primarily do the designated trail condition monitoring and the undesignated trail monitoring. I'll be presenting the undesignated trail monitoring results. Is this on? Sorry. Should I repeat that? Has everybody heard me? Okay. A little bit about my background. My undergraduate degree is in ecology and evolutionary biology. I then worked for the U.S. Forest Service building wilderness trails, then came to the city, open space, built designated trails here, and while doing that, studied GIS at night school and transitioned into a GIS tech role and then into the trail research work group.
And I'm Hillary Deese. I am the Trail Stewardship Program Lead, so I do project management with the Trails group, and then also I've been working on developing the undesignated trail program the last 2 years. I come from an anthropology background with a natural resource focus, which really focused on how people interact with the environment. So this was right up my alley, and it was really exciting to get to work on this here. And I'll be talking after Jake's presentation about the program that we're working on developing to help address some of the undesignated trail management that we have.
All right, and with that, I'll go straight into undesignated trail monitoring. That's a picture of what I look like when I'm out there. So I'll start by just explaining what an undesignated trail is and what I mean when I speak about undesignated trails. Undesignated trails are often referred to as social trails. I've heard user trails, rogue trails, pilot trails. Essentially, they're unplanned, undesigned trails that are walked into our system, and they can often be unsustainable, as this picture shows here. Pretty steep grades and lots of active erosion. That's opposed to a designated trail. Now, I'll acknowledge not all of our designated trails look like this, but the idea of a designed trail that can lessen environmental impacts, sustainable grades to make them more maintainable is the idea there. Also, when we say undesignated trails, we're referring to some other pathway types that aren't necessarily trails. This is a picture of an undesignated road. This is a forestry road. They're using that to do forestry mitigation work, and that will be restored after that work is done, but that also falls into the category of this monitoring. Additionally, there is a kind of awkward category of trail roads. So as you can see from this picture, this is a obvious both vehicle and human use pattern trail. A little bit about the background on undesignated trail monitoring. In 2005, the Visitor Master Plan called for the mapping of the location and extent of undesignated trails to be completed every 5 years. Surveys were conducted in 2002 and 2006 with varying methodology. And I say first comparable study was 2011, 2012, because that was the first study that developed a protocol that could reduce inter-observer variability. That's the same protocol that I used in the most current round of monitoring. A little bit about the methods in that monitoring. Undesignated trails are collected as points. Each one of those points has a photo attached to it. It describes what kind of pathway we're looking at, and built features on undesignated trails are also mapped. The most recent monitoring added function, the observed reason for why a trail exists on the landscape, and condition class, and I'll get into that a little more now. So this is an example of a Class N trail. These are actually defined as not a trail, but can be important for management purposes as they are often recovering or emerging undesignated trails. The next level, Class L, you can think low impact. This is impeded vegetation growth, but still some organic litter cover, not a lot of bare soil. Following that are Class M trails, moderate impact. That's where you start to see a lot of the bare soil, not a lot of organic litter. And then the final class of high impact trails, that's the highly eroded, loose rocks, almost no vegetation or organic litter cover. So overall, high-level results were 164 miles of undesignated trails and roads mapped in the most recent survey. That's a decrease of 14 miles from the 2011-2012 survey, but it's not necessarily as simple as saying 14 miles disappeared from the system. Of the mileage mapped in 2018, 45 miles of that were new, not mapped in 2012. 59 miles of that, of the 2012 mileage, was not mapped in 2018. Unfortunately, we don't have a great system to explain why those trails disappeared. Some of it could be natural revegetation, some restoration work, the designation of trails. Hillary will talk later about some asset management software that could help us determine the why and why trails are disappearing from the system. Of the 164 miles, 118 remain in the same corridor. That means they could have shifted a couple feet, but they are in pretty much the same use pattern as they were in 2012. So a lot of mileage that has just stayed in place, and 56% of that mileage was classified in that condition class H. There's some recreation ecology research that kind of explains this. Impact can happen really quick with use, and Hillary will kind of touch on that later as well. I'll dive into some of the functions of undesignated trails that are common. There are 14 types, but I'll just go through some of the more common ones. The most common trail function are these unserved visitor destinations. These are just points where the designated trail system doesn't serve that expected destination. There's about 19 miles of these. Another common type that doesn't need to be explained as much is the shortcuts. And these are actually trails that can cause considerable impact to the designated trail system and oftentimes have those larger grades and quicker rates of erosion. The final function I'd like to touch on, it's not as common, but there's quite a bit, are livestock trails. These are mostly cattle-created trails that connect to the designated trail system. So while they don't show signs of human use, they connect to a designated trail and could be used by our users. The most common type of undesignated road are agricultural roads. There's about 21 miles of those. And I will say there is a separate project that has begun to try to classify some of these differently, because they are permanent infrastructure and can serve an important purpose to open space lands. Built features, as I said, were also mapped. There are about 554 built features mapped on undesignated trails. That includes things like steps, like you can see in the photo, retaining walls, staircases, things of that nature. To give you some context of that number, that's about 3 structures per mile, so that they're not all over the place, and compared to over 14,000 structures on designated trails. There's a whole variety of reasons why these are on trails. Some we literally don't know, and there's formally designated trails in this data set. There's structures that were built to mitigate impacts to designated trail system. It's kind of an interesting find. Another impact type that was found on the system, and it wasn't included in the original protocol to map areas of concentrated use, but during the monitoring it was deemed to be a very important thing to monitor. 166 recorded in a survey. These are really interesting. They occur on our very high use areas, think Sanitas and Chautauqua areas. So they meet the same definitions of an undesignated trail, but they don't have those defined boundaries. And a lot of these are viewpoints and things of that nature, and the department is making a better effort to manage viewpoints actively. For more of a analysis, system-wide look at undesignated trails, here's a map of cell density. So what this is if you broke our system into a grid and then calculated the amount of linear feet of undesignated trails in each grid cell, you get a density for each. And you can see the darker the shade of red, the higher the density of undesignated trails. There's a slight decrease in that number from about 36 feet per acre to 34 feet per acre, but that's actually directly correlated with the increase in land that open space has acquired in that time. So it's remained relatively similar and constant. It does show the patterns that undesignated trails are clustered, and they're usually closer to access points. Another way to look at undesignated trail density is a kernel density tool. In the story map that I'll show later, there's a very useful tool that can show change on the system quickly. So essentially, the darker the red, the higher the undesignated trail density. So this is the Whittemire property where the Lions Lair Trail was built. So this is in 2012, the density of undesignated trails on that property. And then this is in 2018. So by building that designated sustainable option for trail use, we preserve that larger habitat patch in the middle of that property, which is one of the goals of building that trail.
Can you flip back to the other one just for,
So you can see there were use patterns and was acknowledged in the building of a designated trail. And
That northeast section, is that the hairpin in Sunshine Canyon Drive? Where people
that's
park?
above that a little bit. There's a community access trail there. Is that where you're?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there's some houses back there. For an example of a more challenging area, here's the Saddle Rock and Amphitheater trails in 2012. And here is 2018. So you can see a pretty significant increase in the density in that area. So you can see some change over time. And this is kind of a common thing to see with these trails that are in poor condition. If you can't see where the trail is, you start to wander off. Another metric to kind of look at from a landscape perspective at undesignated trails and how they affect the system as a larger piece is land fragmentation. Now, I will acknowledge that the science on land fragmentation is pretty mixed. The effect of trails on wildlife movement patterns has been studied and has various results. For this analysis, every trail, road, undesignated or designated, was included as a barrier to fragment the landscape. So even though there's less mileage mapped in the most recent study, the system is more fragmented than it was in 2012. It's a slight decrease in average patch size of about 3 acres, but that's also considering land that we've acquired in that time. This type of analysis is really best suited when you're looking at a habitat-specific or species-specific, and at this landscape scale, it kind of gets a little skewed. But if you look at it from the perspective of if you don't have any trails, which is the pane on the left, and you only consider roads as barriers to land fragmentation, you see the larger block sizes on the map on the left. In the middle is if you only consider the designated trail system, and then on the right is the undesignated. So you can see how fragmented the landscape gets when you're considering undesignated trails. Another interesting find are signs on undesignated trails. It didn't really change from 2012. There were 460 signs found on 347 sign structures. What that means is if you look at the picture to the right, a sign structure is that fence post, and it has 2 signs to 1 sign structure. More interestingly, 42% of the signs found along undesignated trails are regulatory in nature. So as you can see on this picture, no bikes, no dogs, those are regulatory. And of that 42%, about half are regulatory dog signage. So you can imagine as a visitor, it's hard to tell whether this is designated or undesignated. To give some more context of...
Do I misunderstand? You're saying that the people somehow obtain your signage?
No. I'm saying we have placed the signage here, and it's important to regulate our landscape, but
I see.
It's hard for a visitor to approach this and know whether
because these signs are where there's an undesignated trail, right?
Correct.
Right. So in a sense, it's an area where you're allowed to go off trail, which creates, in a sense, the undesignated trail. And then we want to tell people, well, what are the rules?
Right. And Hillary will kind of discuss some signage ideas later. But yeah, it can confuse visitors. To give some context of what 460 signs mean, we have over 3,000 signs on our system. So it's really not a huge number, but you can see the confusion that creates. I will go ahead and plug the story map if you haven't explored it. I'll show it now. This is a way that And hopefully it loads here. Okay. Should I? It works earlier.
The black hole. Yes. Demo gremlins.
Yeah. All right, great. This is a report format that I kind of experimented with and determined that it really displayed the spatial nature of the data well. You can explore the data that was collected and kind of get an idea of what it means. So you can go in and you can click on these points and see, you know, a photo of what we're talking about here.
So Jake, I was going to ask you about those points. How do you determine the points?
So a point is taken every 200 feet if none of the condition, function, pathway type changes. If anything, any one of those features or functions changes, then a point is taken. And you can see that's in this legend here. The change points are where something has changed in the trail. Midpoints are just, should be about every 200 feet. Sometimes it's usually more than every 200 feet, and then a start and end point. So with this tool, we can look at what trails are undesignated and what are designated, and it could be a tool for the public to really gain an understanding of that. We can go and look at the trail that was discussed earlier in the gun range conversation and see how it is slated to be or proposed to be designated in the North TSA. So that is over here. There's the gun range. There's that proposed designated trail. And then
Go back to that one.
all right, it'll reload the map.
You know this area too well. You know the clicks too well.
So zoom in here. There's the gun range, and
I
there's
think it's
that.
to the left of there that the Hidden Valley.
Right, and it's up here.
Yeah.
And just so we don't, I was actually talking about something different. I don't want to, so this doesn't get confused. The green on your map is what will be the Wrangler Trail, and that's set. Then the proposed trail would come roughly off of where your arrow is. I don't know if that got confused in our discussion.
No, I just,
okay.
That's an example that I thought I'd show. I'll go look at that kernel density tool, which is really the best tool to see change really quick on our system. So I'll zoom in over here to Gun Barrel Hill as an example. So on the left here is 2012, and then as I scroll right, it shows the change to 2018. So that's a really interesting tool to play with to
Go back
see
again.
change. So you can also see some land that was acquired there. Yeah, so I encourage the use of this tool. It's really the best way to understand this data. And a final kind of fun slide here is, these are all my GPS tracks from the mapping wandering. So it's about 800 miles of walking to map that 164 miles of undesignated trails and roads. And with that, I'll hand it over to Hillary.
Best job in the department there, Jake.
Are you the guy that shows up on all the Strava maps?
I don't use Strava, so no, it's not me.
Right. Great. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing with all that really awesome information that Jake spent 800 miles collecting, and how we're going to consolidate it and condense it and move forward with that information. So I want to talk just briefly about the background of the Undesignated Trail Program and put some context to it. Give a brief program overview. It's kind of an unwieldy program as it is now, and I want to focus in on some management actions that come from our public planning processes, and then talk about the asset management software that we're using to prioritize and track the work that we're doing. And then I just want to briefly touch on challenges and what we're looking forward to doing as our next steps. So similarly, in the Visitor Master Plan 2005, it directed OSMP to develop a program to assess undesignated trails, and then every subsequent public planning process document since then has also mentioned how important this is, and given various advice and efforts and direction in the development of a program. And this is really a continuation and a collection of all those efforts, and then trying to move forward in a interdisciplinary and a holistic way so that we can prioritize across all of our department objectives and goals in order to make sure that we're meeting as many of them as we can at any one time. And then also, most recently, it was a Tier 2 ecosystem health and resiliency strategy in the master plan. And I think that's specifically said to reduce undesignated trails in sensitive areas. We have I wasn't able to actually make.
Can you speak up just a little bit?
I can try. It's not a strong suit of mine. Like I said, we have an interdisciplinary team, so we've got, I believe, 9 folks on the core team now, and we are across 4 different work groups. And then we also reach out to all the work groups to get input on different areas of developing the program where we think that we're lacking expertise in the core area, and also just making sure that we're on track to keep everybody's goals in mind when we're thinking about managing undesignated trails. Some people might ask, why is this a focus? You're allowed to go off trail in most places. Is it really that big of an issue? And it is. Every single land management agency has to grapple with undesignated trails across the world, so it's not a unique problem, even though Boulder is very unique in lots of ways. Undesignated trails are not unique to Boulder. We are experiencing a lot of increase in visitation. So from the 2004 visitor use survey to the 2017, there was a 34% increase. We have 6.3 million visits a year. That's a lot of visits for any system. I think a common misconception is that as you increase the use, you automatically increase the impact, and it's a 1-to-1 ratio. More use, more impact. That's not true. A lot of the recreation and ecology research shows that a lot of the impact happens very quickly, not necessarily through a lot of use, and then it kind of tapers off until you and that's moving from the Class N trails all the way to the Class H trails. Maybe it stabilizes, and then you get a huge increase in visitation, and then the use impact increases again. So this is really important, especially when we're talking about how do we manage trails that are emerging on the system and reacting in real time to those emergent trails. Another really important piece of information, there was a 2015 study done in conjunction with some researchers from Penn State and then the Liebno Trace Center for Outdoor Ethics based here in Boulder. Some fascinating findings from that study. 42% of the respondents in that survey didn't realize that there were undesignated trails or something called an undesignated trail or a social trail on OSMP land, which was interesting. And the other, I think, more important piece is that nearly 50% of the visitors who were observed while traveling on an undesignated trail also were surveyed, saying that they only traveled on designated trails. So the authors summarized that, or came to the conclusion that those folks just didn't know that they were on an undesignated trail. They thought they were doing the right thing and traveling on a designated trail. So that's important when we're trying to understand the behavior and where it comes from and how can we address it most effectively. So that's kind of the overview, hopefully some context, or sorry, the background and some context. The overview, we separated out as a core team a bunch of different areas that we thought needed additional attention. A lot of that came from Jake's data, and then a lot of it just came from subject matter experts really knowing how they interact with, like how their expertise interacts with the land. We needed to be able to make it manageable. This is a complex and occasionally daunting task to think about how to manage. We also wanted to play to everybody's strengths that is at the department. So making it manageable, these are all the different little ways that we decided that we needed to break things out. And this seems much more manageable than just saying, let's deal with undesignated trails, but it's still a little overwhelming. So what we did as a core team was we created a visual aid to help really wrap our mind around and communicate what our goals and objectives, and breaking out into little pieces what that could look like. So this is just a visual tool. It's not a decision-making tool or anything like that. But we did find some like 4 areas we could coalesce our ideas around. The area in the green that's on the right of the screen, so those are the areas where undesignated trails are in an area that have had a planning process that's happened, and they're given a management action. So designate, restore, or retain, and then I'll put a little asterisk next to the no recommendation, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then we recognize that there are areas where we haven't had a planning process. So the east area has not had a public planning process, so we don't have any management recommendations or actions for undesignated trails in those areas, as well as other areas that we may acquire, like Shanahan. That would also fit in that category. And then the yellow at the bottom, those are tools or techniques or policies that OSMP has or can have that will help support the structure of this program and give it some heft. And then the gray are all the different types of trails that Jake mapped, mostly the function of the trails, and really trying to get at why they were created so we can really address them in the best way. So again, this
Hillary, is there a correlation between the areas, in the sections?
There's not. You mean for how many miles?
Yeah, or something? Yeah.
No, I have done that exercise, and some of them are, I should have done it here, are like, for instance, in the gray on the left, roads is about 40 miles, 40 or 50 miles. And then I'm trying to think, climbing access is much, much, much smaller. So it kind of made it hard to read. So there's not any correlation, but I can get that for you if you'd like.
And is this a more recent version than the printed version we got? Because they're different.
They're different colors, same information.
But it's arranged differently as well.
I may have rearranged them a little bit.
So it's random. Well, there's no reason for the revision.
So you confused us.
I'm so sorry. Originally there, in one of our interdepartmental presentations, this was animated like the Wheel of Fortune. So it was a little bit more random, a little bit more colorful, which is closer to the version that you got in the paperwork. I can get you a copy of this one if you'd like.
No, it's just a question of the information.
Oh, yeah, no, it's the same. It's just
it's supposed to be the same, or whether you've made some revisions.
I have not made any revisions. But I do want to dive in and talk a little bit more about once an undesignated trail does have a management action attached to it, how does it go from being in the plan to being designated, restored, or retained to on-the-ground implementation? So first I'd like to talk a little bit about how does a trail become a designated trail if it started off as an undesignated trail. There are 13 miles of currently undesignated trail that is to be designated. So it goes through a public engagement, public planning process. Once it gets on the work plan, it goes into a design phase. That's where our trail staff will go out, start getting boots on the ground, hiking, looking at alignments, working closely with resource staff to make sure that we're taking in their concerns, permitting that would happen, or start to happen in this phase at least. And this can take multiple years too, depending on the workloads, resources available. Once all of that is approved through resource staff and we make sure that everybody's happy, we'll start construction. That can also take multiple years depending on the complexity of the project itself, if it's machine built, if it's hand built, how many crews do we have for how long. And usually in conjunction with the construction, we're restoring both our impacts as we're constructing the trail, but also through sustainable trail design, we often have to move the undesignated trail corridor out, give it gentler grades usually. Sometimes we have to move it around for resource concerns. So then we often have to restore the previous use pattern, which is the undesignated trail, like that footprint. Once all that's done, it's designated. So it gets named, gets put on a map, and it gets signed.
And Hillary, are those 13 miles all coming out of TSAs?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. And then arguably the most important part of this process is once it's designated, it becomes a trail that we maintain. So we do the biannual, correctly how you say that, trail maintenance on that. So we get eyes on it at least twice a year, and just bring it into the fold. That's from plan to implementation, how an undesignated trail becomes a designated trail. For restoring undesignated trails, we have 27 miles. I broke out approximately where those miles are at in relation to the management area designations they fall into. So the largest category is natural areas, then the in-car, NIST, and then some agricultural area. It's actually only 1/10 of a mile, so very small amount. And then HCA's and passive rec make up the last couple miles of that. This is a little bit more straightforward. We go right to the restore of that other flow chart, straight to that, and then make sure we monitor that for whether or not that restoration treatment held. One of the other pieces of that wheel that was on the yellow part was we really wanted to standardize what our restoration treatments are and match them to the behaviors and the reasons why we think the trail was even created in the first place. There's been a lot of literature showing that there's intent, understanding that you need to know the intent behind a behavior to most successfully lower the barrier to having that pro-environmental behavior that you want to have, which in our case is having them stay off of the area we are restoring and on a designated trail. So matching our response to the behavior makes a lot of sense. So for those unintentional behaviors, those 42% of people who didn't know that there were undesignated trails or thought that they were on the designated trail, most effective is education and outreach, small signs, and then visually obscuring the pathway we don't want them to take. So very light-handed, interpersonal. If that doesn't work, then we can start adding fences, some larger signs, some more information. We may even import materials such as erosion netting or larger rocks from nearby to help do more active restoration. If that still doesn't work, then it's more of the same of that, either extending the fence length or maybe adding multiple layers of fence to really help those opportunistic folks that say, I could jump one fence, but maybe not two fences. So starting to increase our treatments as the behavior moves towards the intentional. And then finally, we would potentially increase ranger presence in the area or require folks travel on trail for a certain area, just in order to give the restoration treatments a chance to really take hold so that they would be more successful. All the while, we are monitoring for success or failure of any of these treatments and making sure that we're addressing them mostly as they fail so we can keep adding to them and not backpedaling at all. The last management action that you can have on an undesignated trail is retain. This is less than 3 miles of trails, so very small portion. Typically, this is non-visitor infrastructure, some operation roads, and then also some specific access for user groups. There's a climbing access in Skunk Canyon that is technically a retain on an undesignated trail. And really, in terms of managing them, we're not restoring them and we're not designating them. They're just kind of in this liminal space. We just know that they're there. And finally, the little asterisk I spoke about earlier is no recommendation. So this is actually huge mileage. So to Dave's point, if that triangle or the circle was statistically the right size, this would be a huge chunk of that area. It's over 120 miles. 64 of those miles that have no recommendation are in areas that have already had a public planning process, but those trails have emerged since that plan happened, and therefore have no management recommendation that's been through a public vetting process, which, as you can imagine, makes it a little challenging to know what exactly to do with them all the time. And then 68 of the miles are in the east area and would be involved with the east area plan whenever that happens. And this really, I think, highlights the challenge of being able to have a tool to know when we do need additional public outreach in order to make some action decisions on those emergent trails. And some of those trails have been there for 10 years or maybe more, and so some of them are very well established. And you wouldn't know the difference between the designated trail or undesignated trail. And then I really quickly would like to just zoom over to the structural components and talk a little bit about the asset management software that we've are employing. So for the undesignated trail, part of this, we are using it to prescribe, prioritize, and track the work that we've done. We're using it to look at trends and how successful or how not successful certain restoration treatments are in certain areas. And then I think, well, maybe one of the coolest things about this is we'll be able to set up reminders to go back and look at things. So even as staff changes, as there's turnover, as priorities shift, we'll be able to have a record of what went in, where, and when, and then remind somebody, in 2 years, go check on that fence and see if it's still up or if it needs to be removed, or go grab that sign. And hopefully that will cut down on some of these restoration treatments that, through no fault of anybody's, just kind of get forgotten out in the field. And this is just a quick screenshot of Beehive is the name of the software. So this is the Sage Eagle area up at BVR.
I'm sorry, where is it?
Sage Eagle.
Okay.
So there's two kind of parallel undesignated trails, one's to be restored and one's to be designated. So with this program, what we will be able to do is mark physically, well, not physically, but locate it on a map. And then from there, we'll be able to estimate what restoration treatments we think we might need, how many hours we think it might take, what work group, what resources we think are going to be the best for tackling that, and then also which priorities areas that is going to hit. And this will feed into a report that we can run and pull out all the times that once we enter this in, we'll have access to all this, and we hopefully really easy to make a work plan off of that. So we could pull all the junior ranger projects that are appropriate for them and grab them for 6 weeks every summer, or whatever it is. But I think it's going to be a really powerful tool to track a lot of this work. And speaking of priorities, this is the framework that we're using to prioritize which trails, regardless of their management action, they have assigned to them, which ones get on the work plan when. So we're looking at visitor safety and experience, ecological and cultural resource concerns, and then where we can bundle work that's adjacent to other departmental work to get the most bang for our buck in terms of utilizing resources while they're out there. So the visitor safety and experience, I've been sitting out with the ranger group, and they've been really awesome and forthcoming with their areas that they think are hotspots, areas where they see a lot of people lost or lots of injuries, or just areas that aren't offering the kind of experience that we want to be able to offer on our designated trail system. And so collecting that information is super useful. And then also other staff input and public input, CRMs. This would all feed into this part of the prioritization. We're also looking at ecological and cultural resource concerns, so meeting with those groups to figure out where their highest concerns are, what layers do we use, what buffers are we putting on them, how do we prioritize within their frameworks, what they would like to see done when, and then balancing that with where we're already doing other work. So one of the Saddle Rock, Jake showed how it has gotten significantly worse. We're piloting something there where we're going to put out signs in 2019 and 2020, so the end of this year, end of next year, that talk about the trail project that's happening in a couple years, talk about why we're restoring, talking about actually signing undesignated trails, letting folks know that they're leaving the designated trail system, and then seeing if we can just stack that work year after year and try and really change those use patterns effectively. And then in CAR, we're also working with WRV, which is a volunteer group, to do some restoration in that area. And then the last 2 years, we've done cross-training opportunities between our restoration crew and our trail crew to let them know the kind of work we do, and then they help us with the restoration and teaching our crews how to do that effectively. So all of that gets condensed down and distilled, and we still have to balance it between what we think might be successful and how many resources we need to do that. So with 100 and however many miles I've already forgotten, undesignated trails we have to be able to balance some of that low-hanging fruit that we know will be successful and won't take a lot of resources with some of those more involved multi-year projects. So making sure that we grab a variety of different projects types when we're doing our work planning, or else it will all go by the wayside. I'm very proud of that transition.
Rightfully so.
Yeah. Some of the challenges that we see, I mentioned it earlier, we do have increasing visitation. I don't foresee that slowing down anytime soon. There has been some concerns from different user groups about a loss of access and how closing and restoring undesignated trails might affect their access. I think we have a somewhat unique challenge here where we have visitor travel. Visitors can typically travel where they like, and that is obviously challenging for managing undesignated trails, especially when you think about how quickly they can impact the area. Revisiting travel patterns. So one of the tenets of leaving a trace is dispersed travel versus concentrated, and figuring out which way is the best to get folks where they want to go with the least impact. Some areas where dispersed travel might have been appropriate 10, 15, 20 years ago may no longer be the appropriate way that we want to get folks to and from where they are trying to get in our system. And so revisiting some of those ideas and areas. Obviously, informing visitors of the impacts of their actions is going to be very helpful and useful in helping manage this. And then resource and staff constraints. We'd love to do it all, but we can't because we have lots of other projects we're all trying to juggle as well. So moving forward, in 2020, we have 10 weeks of youth corps, 8 to 10 weeks of youth corps, high school age students that will be working all summer doing trail restoration on undesignated trails. We'll be very interested to see how well they do. 2021, we're looking at a funding request so that we can start signing some areas with some simple, you're leaving a designated trail system, trying to bring up that acknowledgement of the difference between the trails. Saddle Rock, I already mentioned we're working on a multi-year plan to try and slowly establish the use patterns we want to see and doing it in conjunction with trail work on the designated trail. The data cleanup, Jake alluded to that, making sure that if it's a road and we want to manage it as a road, then it is a road and it's not an undesignated trail. So looking at taking a good look at some of our numbers and the monitoring methods to make sure that that is cleaned up as best we can. And really just taking that wheel of action, we've been calling it, and running out each of those points to their logical end and getting as much information as we can, building coalitions, coming up with standard operating procedures, coming to agreement on some sometimes thorny issues with how we want to manage these trails. That was my part of this, so now I'd like to open up to questions to either Jake about his monitoring or to myself.
Well, thank you both for the huge amount of work that went into pulling all of that together, and for the packet, and for the really helpful presentation. I guess my inclination, at least initially, I don't know how long this is like or how deep this dive is going to go. I might just start by saying it might make sense to structure this a little bit by saying if you have questions for Jake, which are probably not in the nature of sort of actions, but are just better understanding the raw material, maybe we ought to start there so we're at least operating on a common understanding of the underlying data if there are any such questions, and then move on to some of the more policy-oriented questions that people want to ask and comment on.
My Jake comment is just to encourage everyone that has an interest in open space or trails or anything related to go to that link that's on the first page of this and go through some of the stuff they've shown, because it's just packed with information and analysis that is quite eye-opening, and it was, I'm sure, a huge effort to create the database and the interfaces and everything else, but it's a wonderful tool, and I would just encourage people to go see it. So that's my question for Jake.
Okay. I would make a comment that that I like the fact that we are sort of continuing and accentuating the terminology that we're using here and moving away from the notion of sort of social trails, which I think for a long time was sort of the standard vernacular. And the problem was it was too broad, and it was if you said social trail, people all had this sort of image of often like a shortcut on a switchback or something that almost everyone would agree, well, probably doesn't serve a particularly useful purpose. But as you've shown, it's really a much more multifaceted issue, and I think the conversation and the process of making decisions about it is way better when you've kind of broken it out, thinking about, roads and various destinations that are, and understanding the underlying, sort of why this trail is there and what bucket to put it in. So I certainly commend the approach.
Thank you.
I have some questions to understand the mileage numbers that have been thrown out, because as I read through the packet, I really got confused, and I had no understanding of where these numbers were in relationship to those numbers. So I'd like to start on page 8, where you say the total number of miles of undesignated trails is 164 miles. Correct?
Correct.
And then you say in the last 6 years, from 2012 to 2018, based on, and this is the first gold star, for having a standard protocol that you used, which is really critical to where we're headed, I think. You found that there were 45 new miles of social trails and 59 miles of restored, designated, or revegetated trails, which leaves you with a net loss of 14 miles of undesignated trails. In other words, the 164 miles goes down to 150 miles. Is that right?
The decrease is from 178 miles that were mapped in 2012.
Huh. Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's in the...
Okay, in 2012, there were 178.
Correct.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
So in those 6 years, you got a approximately 9% decrease in undesignated trails. In the 2005 Visitor Master Plan, the target that was set is that we will have no more than 50 miles of undesignated trails.
Correct.
So at the current rate of decrease of 9%, that means maybe in 48 years we'll hit our target, if I've done the math right.
That's assuming we don't get any better at.
So the hope is that we can get better at that with all these systems that you've developed to move things forward.
Yeah.
Potentially.
Yeah, that's ultimately one goal. I think another thing is looking at whether or not like cattle trails always comes to mind. Like, are those trails actually being used by people? Can we re-examine the methodology? What about these roads that we're actually actively using for operations or our lessees are using? Do those really need to be in this inventory? Do they belong in this inventory? And so that would also hopefully start picking away at some of that. But we would like to get better at restoring and designating some of our trails as well.
Well, because ultimately, as I understand it, the natural resource implications for eliminating undesignated trails is the pot of gold at the end of this effort, right? I mean, I didn't see that anywhere on your list of challenges. Your slide with challenges is all about trails, but as I read the packet, you repeatedly said that the problem with these undesignated trails is many are in high-value areas.
Yeah, I will say I probably have a little bit of a bent towards the trail side because that is the department I come from. I think it's also important to recognize that it's a people, I see it as a people management issue. So the people who are making the undesignated trails, we need to manage to some degree that travel in order to have a end goal of having the resource, making the resources better and addressing those concerns, if that answers your question.
Well, but a huge charter purpose of our open space system is preserving high-quality natural habitats, not creating trails everywhere in the whole system.
I think that's an underlying component of the management is targeting trails in those sensitive areas. You know, that's a major feed into our prioritization process.
Can I?
And
So just let me follow up on that, Jake. So from my reading, it looks like from your work, there were about 50% of the undesignated trails were really in what we call sensitive or, you know, high-value ecological areas. Right. So I think that's really important to know. It's like those areas are receiving a fair amount of use. But my question then comes back to the report, Hillary, that you presented in that it looks like, I'm just looking at HCA's as presumably one of those, you know, sensitive areas, and the restoration component of the 26 miles or whatever for HCA's is like 2 miles. And so my question is, it follows up on Karen's, is that in prioritizing, are we looking at those, you know, highly sensitive areas as being high priority? And if so, shouldn't, you know, the relative miles or either number of trails or miles of trail be relatively higher on an annual basis so that those areas are receiving the attention we think they deserve?
Yeah, absolutely.
For the sake of the natural resources.
Right.
Absolutely. And I didn't want to imply that we weren't taking into account like going after HCA's potentially first, but also there's only 2 miles that need to be restored in HCA's. And so it's such a small piece of the puzzle that I worry about getting nearsighted and only looking at that as a way to prioritize instead of reaching out to the ecological staff and the rest of our resource staff and coming up with some bigger, broader goals that they're feeding us, or like while I'm making this prioritization, in order to get after some of those that might not be in HCA's but are also ecologically sensitive, but they're in a passive area. So that would then rise up.
That's where I'm going though with this. So you're looking at the management areas as kind of the framework for the analysis or the decision making. Why aren't, or maybe I missed it, but why aren't we looking at this, you know, those ecologically important areas or the sensitive areas as far as the framework for the decision making as well, so that we can one could compare, okay, these are kind of what's happening in the relative management areas, but, you know, in our high quality ecosystem areas, you know, here's what's happening, and so that you can build some kind of relationship between those two elements.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are taking all of that into account. I just thought it would be a fun exercise to break up where those 26 miles are located across the existing management area designations that we have. That's not an end-all be-all, and we're not necessarily prioritizing only based on that. We are taking all this other input from all the other staff in order to try and prioritize that, regardless of what management area they actually are in.
Right.
And then also, you know, if it's adjacent to trail work that we're already doing, like let's bring that up, the prioritization, like let's get that on the work plan sooner so we can tackle those areas in a more timely fashion.
So some of us would see that as equally as fun as the management areas.
I'll also point out that the 2 miles you're referencing are miles that were in a pre-existing planning document. There's another 40 miles of trails in HCA's, and some of those just are emergent and don't have an recommendation. Correct.
Right.
Wow.
And that's the part that I get vague on. I mean, it seems to me there's a certain subsection here that exists within TSAs, and there's guidance. We decided through a planning process, we're going to try to close these, or in general, this amount. I don't know if you need more planning superstructure to give you cover for doing things outside of TSAs. I mean, the thing I keep coming back to is gun barrel, where we met with the communities, we looked at all the different resources and the different attributes, and then staff went away and did a lot of work to see how we could reduce undesignated trails, and we had different options. If you don't have a process like that, a local planning process, what's your anticipation for how you would proceed on closing undesignated trails? Because I have a feeling that at some point you're going to be sort of out there by yourselves, and if you have to explain to a public why we're closing this one, you're not going to be able to point to something simple. You're going to have to say, well, we look at a 12-factor equation, and which could be exactly the right thing to do. It's just not embedded within something we can all point to and say, yeah, we agreed that was the best process. Do you see where I'm going?
Yeah, no, that is absolutely.
If you need something from us or the public that gives you cover, please tell us.
I think we've sort of broken down the original, which is fine, since I think we're now on the sort of shot past the original structuring.
Really short.
Yeah, that's fine. A suggestion on sort of process, and I agree with Kurt that, a fair amount of this, I think you already have sufficient guidance, either from prior TSA plans or from just general understandings that we've reached about what are our priorities and what's worth retaining and what should be, retain's the wrong word, what should be, formally designated, et cetera. There's probably a relatively small category where you don't need any full-blown public process a la Gun Barrel Hill or Gebhard, but it's not just sort of a little nothing that you're unlikely to get any pushback on. And I would recommend the same process that we used relatively recently, where a trail that we've agreed should be built, but staff determines that, gee, the actual alignment is going to differ somewhat substantially from the conceptual alignment in a TSA. And what we've said and what we've been doing is saying, why don't we just include it in a packet saying, hey, what we did was, there's some hypothetical trail and it's going to differ in a meaningful way. We don't need a full-blown process, but let's alert the board to it, which serves the function of also alerting the public. And if there's some pushback, all right, well, then we can decide, do we need to dive into this further? And I would say the same is probably true here, that there were going to be a few examples, and I'm betting it's relatively few, where you think, I don't know, this is kind of in the gray area where we might want a little, at least sort of cover, rather than just, unbeknownst to people, just start closing it. And one way of, sort of low-cost way of doing that is just to say, well, we'll alert the board through the packet that, hey, there's a pretty substantial trail that we're going to close, but it's, a few months down the road, and let us know. And if someone thinks, oh, wait a minute, I actually think a different outcome for that trail is appropriate, they can speak up. There may be times when it's not a bad idea to also just put a sign at the physical sign at the trail. And this would be rare, but I can think of a few where the trail may have a sufficient constituency behind it that rather than just show up one day and see a crew, not a bad idea a few months ahead of time to just put a sign that says this trail, this undesignated trail is slated for closure. For further information, see such and such. And if people are upset about that, there's, they can reach out and we can then address it more formally. It seems to me there's a few pretty low-cost ways of alerting people to some actions in the relatively rare cases where you think this is a little bit more complicated question. It doesn't clearly fit in one bucket or the other.
And one thing that will do is educate us about what your process is, which I think would be really helpful. The other sort of related question for you folks, we have a lot of evaluation factors that can be applied to individual pieces of trails, but I think all of us would probably agree that it makes sense when you're starting to do that to look at the local system, because you're really talking about rerouting use and trying to figure out, well, how are people that used to do this, what are they going to do? And I keep coming back to Gun Barrel. That process looked at that whole setting, and so it tried to figure out what was the ecology of use, and then what alternatives could work within that. So I don't know if that's how you're thinking you're going to attack this issue, is to look at an area and have sort of an area plan, if you will. I think it is easier to explain to local citizens if you can show them sort of your area plan, rather than just they go to their favorite trail and it's closed, and they wonder, well, what do I do now? So that's, again, just a thought to add on to Tom's.
I want to climb on the notion of using signs more and better, because I was in an area this last weekend where I couldn't find where the trail was. And I finally got into an area where there was a lot of that webbing along the ground, and I thought, this looks like somebody's trying to close this. So where the hell's the trail? And I walked back and forth and around, and the trail was a considerable distance back with no sign on it to direct you to the trail, as opposed to the trail that had webbing on it that was obviously some former version of a trail. So if the signage is not good, you're just asking people to wander around on the land. And so I think real attention needs to be made to signage, both this is where the trail is, and as you were saying, this is not where the trail is, it's that away.
Absolutely, and signs was one of the areas in the structural component that we identified as something that does need more attention. It needs a bigger team of people with more expertise. Rangers will need to be brought in, because I have no idea what their regulatory needs are for signing areas, but it has been identified as an area both for being more, oh my gosh, it's too late, I'm losing my words, more concise with our signage and more consistent with how we're signing things.
And explanatory, the why.
Sure, so the L&T study in 2015 has some really interesting conclusions about what messaging formats and what actual messages are most effective. So we will be leaning on studies like that to develop that.
That leads me to a comment I wanted to make. I thought your presentation about sort of viewing areas and these areas that aren't really trails but are kind of being highly impacted. One I'll point to would be on the backside of some of the Flatirons. I'm a rock climber. And I think the management process in steep terrain is a really challenging beast, because you're directly dealing with people making decisions about their own suffering and shortcutting, et cetera.
Suffering.
Yeah. What I encourage is, I really do think we're going to need to be very innovative. I think we should be reaching out to the recreation groups that have interest. They're dealing with similar issues all around the country, to consider what might be some good resolutions. I don't know if that includes quasi-permanent cairning. There's many things we have to think about and explore. I worry that over-signing can become its own eyesore. I just encourage us to stay nimble, loose, and to talk with people about what they're learning about around the country to sort of understand best practice.
Thank you.
Hillary, I've got a couple of questions for you.
Oh, no. All right.
So in reading the report, which I thought was very good, it wasn't clear to me that the 2017-2018 study information was actually a information source for your report, because you didn't cite it anywhere. You cited a bunch of plans and everything, but did you use Jake's work to?
Yes, absolutely. His was the backbone. Sorry, Jake, for not sourcing your work specifically. I didn't want to pull, I knew I had seen Jake's report. I knew that would be attached, so I didn't want to duplicate efforts in any way. The way that his report and monitoring really filtered in was by him assigning a function to the trails that really allowed us to pick apart and tease out areas. And there's spreadsheets upon spreadsheets that I could show you later about what we've done with Jake's data. And the report is more really, how are we going to communicate this? How do we ask for help? What are we asking for help about? But Jake's data was used like intensively in the creation of this.
Well, if I may make a suggestion, I think that you ought to acknowledge his work up front and very prominently, because it was good work, and I think certainly meets some of the needs that we've been talking about as far as information, for the public to consider, and that it should definitely be acknowledged in this. The other thing I was going to ask, on restoration treatments, you use some language that I have no idea. An escalatory model, I have no idea what that is. I was thinking scatological when I was looking at escatorial, and it's like, what is that?
Sure.
And then a stout treatment, I was thinking, well, maybe that's Burton, out on the land when, when we need it.
Yeah, the tip of every triangle is just Burton out there wrangling our visitors. But no, I'm trying to think of the source of that. That was, that graphic is based on a response to regulations in like the restaurant industry. And so there's a model where
The restaurant industry?
Correct. Where you escalate the responses of non-action to certain like fines or violations until it becomes too unbearable to actually continue down the path that you're on. So we're trying to go in with the lightest hand that we can to get the successful restoration, and then if that doesn't work, then we're escalating it to a more heavy-handed approach on and on and on up until Burton's out there.
Well, again, a suggestion, I think, especially if this is for public consumption, you might want to provide a little more explanation.
Absolutely.
That would help people understand, what it is. So.
That's noted. Thank you.
But I have a comment I want to make as well to both of you. This really warms my heart considerably. It's an excellent job on both of your parts, and I think it's kind of a culmination in the evolution of the department's dealing with trails and visitor use. If you look at 25 years ago, which some of us still can do, where we started is almost, embarrassingly distant from where we are now. And especially with, the data that we now have, that we can base, good analyses and good decisions on, it's really amazing, and I think this work is really excellent, and thank you very much.
Thank you. I have, this is sort of a very open-ended general question, but at times when you read this and you look at maintenance issues, honestly, it feels almost, daunting at best and overwhelming at worst, like, wow, this is an enormous amount of work. And so in terms of the financial and human resources that you have, and this is to sort of follow up Karen's question about the sort of rate at which we can knock down the size of this problem, not to put precise numbers on it, but what is your sort of general sense of where you think we might be in 5 years or over some, sensible planning horizon about how much of this problem we can chip away over that kind of time frame?
That isn't.
I won't hold you to it, but I'm curious to understand the sort of just understand the magnitude of what this undertaking looks like particularly relative to other undertakings that we have going on.
Absolutely, and you can't hold me to anything because I won't be able to answer that question.
$40 million of trail maintenance.
Right.
Yeah.
But the 40 million was, I thought that was
designated trails.
right. This is supplemental to that. So,
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and we'll have to get back to you with some specifics.
That's an excellent response.
Thank you.
And the overlay I would add on that is, I won't worry too much about giving you folks cover if you feel like the next 10 years of work are things that are already designated in the TSAs. Then there's really no need to worry about, what support we need to give you. What's your sense? I mean, are you already working outside of TSAs?
No, we're not. At least not to any substantial degree. There are obviously on-the-ground decisions that have to be made for safety reasons or something else that may affect undesignated trails. But we do have our work cut out between, I think, the 26 miles that need to be restored, the 13 that need to be designated. When you think about the restoration can take multiple years, lots and lots of years sometimes in order to work. It means going back. It's a slow process. So I don't know that we'll see the gains in 5 years or maybe even 10 years unless we started going out tomorrow and doing things, which is not currently on the work plan. That's one of the reasons why I included the adjacent to other work as one of the prioritizations so that we can start maybe using that as a tool and rearranging some of our current work plans that already goes 5 or more years out in order to maybe rearrange some things and try and tackle some of these projects that wouldn't otherwise get tackled.
So it sounds like at least for the next few years, your work is going to be principally guided by TSA decisions that have already been made. Yep. And that makes a big difference to me.
And the other thing that seems to me essential in the next 5 to 10 years is to stop digging the hole.
Yeah.
We've got to do something about the increase of 40-some miles of new undesignated trails every so many years. If we don't do that, we're never going to really be making headway on this problem. And that leads me to 2 other things that I'm just curious to know whether you've even discussed in your deliberations so far. Because my sense is that what you've been doing to this point is trying to figure out what the problem is and how to tackle it, right? Yep. As opposed to on the ground actually doing it. There are 2 things that you mentioned that I know, or 3 things that I know are keys to the whole thing. Because in talking to users out on the land, I keep talking to people who are with dogs on no-dog trails or on trails that are undesignated trails. And they give me answers that you allude to on page 66, which is, oh, well, it's on social media, or it's in a guidebook. It says this is the best place to bring dogs. It has no bearing on what OSMP has decided, but somebody else has decided, and those people are taking it as the word that's what's really official, and it's not. So that's one thing, is have you any clue about how to deal with that? Another thing is you allude to one of the sources of how to bring attention to emerging undesignated trails is to use the public. Well, there are millions of people out there on the land all the time, and no matter how many staff we employ, we're going to have millions more feet and eyes on the trails than staff will ever produce. Have you talked about how to utilize that resource in bringing attention to emerging undesignated trails if we're going to address the question of how we avoid getting new undesignated trails? And the third component of it that you point to in your report clearly is what the education and outreach team should be doing and how they should be contributing to this stopping new undesignated trails. So those are the 3 prongs that I think have to do with how we prevent so many miles of new undesignated trails every year. And I'd be curious to know whether you've had any discussions about any of those or have thought more about them.
I think I can talk to all 3 of them. So in terms of the social media aspect, guidebooks, I think it's really important to know that we don't necessarily always control the narrative of how folks experience our land.
That's the problem.
And we did identify that. I just kind of lumped it under the mapping practices. So similarly, there are certain trails that are supposed to be designated that are currently undesignated but are specifically said to not be included in maps. So I think that's something we could talk about as well. Just in that, just general, how are we communicating outwardly where we want folks to go, and knowing that we don't always control that narrative, that there are 6.3 million people telling all their friends where to go. So that we have thought about that and are actively looking to address that. In terms of utilizing visitors and volunteers for emergent trails, we are starting those conversations, but we have not gotten anywhere fruitful quite yet. It was a little bit lower on the priority list in terms of just sussing out some of these other big pieces, but we are thinking about it. And then the final piece you mentioned was the education and outreach. I do want to point out that our education and outreach folks are contributing quite a bit to the education of our visitors and helping keep them informed. But I would like to see at some point maybe some targeted or focused education efforts, maybe doing some more outreach to areas like Gun Barrel Hill, or like some of these other, when we're doing other work in the area, really making sure that folks know kind of the why and giving them as much information as we can to help them make informed decisions on how they're going to interact with our land system. Does that answer all three of your prongs?
I'm glad you're thinking about those things, and I'm waiting for your report next year about how you're going to get there, like pothole reporting or...
Sure, okay.
You know, Karen, there's one interesting thing I didn't know about on page 17, this Strava, I don't know how you pronounce it, but this tracks not all users, but a subset of our users that are using this for their own purposes. But if we start seeing lines showing up where we didn't think there were any trails, that is one way to tell you there's a new trail forming. Is that at all something that can be done, or am I exaggerating the utility of this thing?
Yeah, actually, if you look in the report, I don't know the exact page, but I did look into Strava and comparing that data to some of the condition class data, and there is some amount of, some pattern in those, you know, as Strava use gets higher, the lines get a little thicker, and that does correspond pretty well to the condition classification rating. So there you can see the patterns of use and impact. The trouble that we've had with Strava is there's no background data to it. What does a thicker line actually mean? How many users is that? And it's definitely a tool that could be used and maybe looked into and exploring how to better monitor that. But as of this moment, it's kind of hard to know what you're actually seeing in those maps.
But if you were starting to see lines showing up where you didn't think there were trails,
right?
That's pretty interesting.
It's potentially a tool to use to determine whether cattle trails are actually just cattle trails as well. That was a big finding when I started to dig into some of the Strava data.
Those cattle Strava users.
Good old Greenbrier. That would be fascinating.
I wanted to make a point about the problem of, I'll call them parallel trails, but it's especially a problem on the eastern part of the system. We probably know what we mean, but where there's often a wider trail and then 3 feet, 6 feet, 8 feet off to the side is a second trail. And it's a thorny problem. In some ways, in some cases, you can see where the median strip between the parallel trail and the main trail is actually or is on the verge of collapsing to where you're going to suddenly see a massive widening of the trail, and then, in all likelihood, then a new parallel trail some distance away. And I think some of the sort of sociological research that you cited suggests that part of this, and it's only part, is that people may not realize that we really do prefer that they stay on the trail. And I think we have developed a culture, it's not unique to Boulder, but it's certainly quite present, where I think a huge percentage of people think that, well, if I don't really like being on the trail, I'll just, and it's, whether it's the Boulder Creek path, you see it in many, many places where even where there's a trail that's 8, 10 feet wide, there's still that parallel trail. And I think we have to gradually start pushing back against that culture where there's just an expectation that I shouldn't have to share this trail for whatever reason. I'm running, or I'm going faster or slower, or I don't like dog, whatever the reason is. That, and it's going to take a long time. It's not an overnight thing, but I suspect some signage will start to create that realization that even if you put just a very small, simple sign at the start of a parallel trail that just says, please stay on the main trail, or something like that, I think it'd be interesting to see. Steve Armstead tells me that this is not going to work, and he may be right, that people just go around and pick up the parallel trail 10 feet further down. But I think we do need to at least start tackling some of the sociology here of saying, you know, this actually is discouraged. Because I think right now people, if you ask them, why are you on that little parallel trail? I think a lot of them would say, it would never have occurred to me that I wasn't supposed to be here. There was no indication that this wasn't totally fine. And I think it's probably on us with some fairly small, low-key, but nonetheless clear messaging to start sending the message that, no, actually, we do want you to be on the main trail, and we don't think that throughout the system there ought to be a parallel trail for people who, kind of want that experience. Because I observed there are some places, like if you just go up the main Chautauqua Meadow Trail up to the 1-2, where we have put up some signs. I think there's actually some pretty decent compliance where there are those signs. I think it does, it has some effect at a relatively low cost, both in terms of money and those sort of standard brown signs that we have with a little signage on the very top of the post. They're not that obtrusive. They're not, they're not a big kiosk.
They have a name for those that I didn't know. What's the name for those?
Carcinite.
Say it louder.
Carcinite, is that what you're?
Carcinite, okay. A vote for carcinate, it's sort of a, well, because I think we have, we have almost none of that on the, anyhow, that's my suggestion, is to start thinking about whether, there's an educational component that, needs to start getting tackled.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. I'd also like to point out that with specifically the Chautauqua Trail, there was a redesign. So like bringing in sustainable trail alignment, looking at all the different factors on why that behavior is happening is really important. So making sure that we have sustainable trails for folks to walk on that are as least muddy as we can make them in certain areas, especially out in the east. Making sure education is up there. Fencing and signs in combination were the two most effective means for keeping folks on designated trails through that study. So really utilizing those findings, leveraging that in conjunction with all these other pieces. I think you're right. I think that would be a good way forward.
Well, are we ready to thank Hillary and Jake for, okay?
Same time next year, right?
Yeah, fabulous.
It's on my calendar.
Right.
Thank you so much, you guys. Nice job.
Dan, anything else on matters from the department?
No, that would be it.
All right, so matters from the board. Upcoming public participation events. I think we have two that we may want to notice. One is the Tall Oatgrass Open House on December 5th from 5:30 to 7 at Southern Hills Middle School Library. Okay. And the other is the Gun Barrel Hill ISP meeting on December 9th, 6 to 8 at the Hub. I assume that one. All right. So this is sort of with a nod, we will notice those two meetings as meetings of the Open Space Board. Then that takes us to the email from council in advance of their retreat and setting priorities. So I assume everyone has had at least a chance to look at that after Leah circulated it. So I'll make a proposal.
No idea what you're talking about.
Oh, okay, then I'll go back a step.
Yeah, we put out an email late today. So at the December meeting, every year, council asks what you think are the city's 2020, in this case, priorities should be that the council ought to be really paying attention to. And so it's just that annual exercise is chance for boards and commissions to provide council with feedback on what we think ought to be priorities. And so it's due, we need to get that information in after the December OSBT meeting. So this is really a December action item for you all. But in working with Tom, we decided to daylight it at this time so you guys could have some preparation time of.
And I should just quickly say, has that been made available to the public since we're discussing it? Is that letter available to the public?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Well, why don't I don't know if any members of the public want it, but you just pass that to Leah, and if anybody wants to come up so they at least understand, what letter it is we're talking about, it's available to them.
Sure. Do you want to just read the questions?
Yes, I'll also do that. Thank you. So the three questions from the Council Retreat Committee are, one, One, what do you think the city's top 3 priorities should be for the 2020-2021 work plan? So top 3 priorities.
Top 3 for
Well, that's, it's,
for the city?
no, for the city. But we'll, I'm going to make a proposal on that, but that's picking up on exactly that point. 2, how do your suggestions connect back to the work of your specific board or commission?
Yeah.
Which obviously depends on what the priorities are. And then 3, are there additional boards or commissions that should weigh in on those issues? So the questions have varied from year to year somewhat, but the way we've tackled this, is what I'd probably recommend that we continue here, is that we strive to make a statement on behalf of the board about open space issues, that we ought to be able to reach consensus, or as close as possible, on sort of open space issues that we think council needs to factor into their work plan. And with respect to that, I'd use the same process we've used in the past, which is ask 2 people to, put their heads together between now and the December meeting, craft a short statement, and we can discuss here what, if people have thoughts about that general idea, but at a process level, have 2 people get together and draft something which we can then put up on the screen in December, work through the language, bearing in mind that this is due, I think, just the day or maybe 2 days after our board meeting, so we really do need to wrap it up at the December meeting. We can't go to that meeting with, a further action item. We got to wrap it up. So ask 2 people to draft something on open space issues that hopefully we can make as a joint statement of the board. With respect to non-open space issues, I know, literally that is part of the charge from council, but my sense is from the past and here too, that it would be awfully time-consuming for this board to try to craft a common statement on housing, transportation, energy, climate, budget, what have you, and that the better thing to do is to take up council's alternative suggestion, which is if any member of this board wishes to make a statement to council on how they see priorities outside of the open space area, that just email council with your thoughts on that, and not, and obviously if someone else on the board, you want to get together with that person, it's totally fine to make it a 2-person statement if you have similar views on that, but not try to take what could be hours crafting a joint statement that we may never be able to agree to on the full panoply of city issues. So anyhow, that's my suggestion on the 2 components and a process suggestion on how to tackle each of them.
And I would support that. I think we've done that basically in some years recently for all the reasons that you elucidated. There we go. So I support that. So just to give an example, what we would be doing is giving council a heads up on things we're going to bring to them that are really important, like prairie dog management on irrigated lands. We would say South Boulder Creek flood control and CU South annexation is going to continue to be a hot and important issue for us. We expect to bring you something on that. If we knew when, we'd say when. But this way, we're giving them a heads up about not just the things that we think are important in open space, but things that might come before them, which I think would be really valuable to them, as opposed to, here's how you should redesign the intersection at Colorado and 30th Street, which I don't think we, I think they'll be able to.
That train has left the station.
I think they're not waiting for our input on that, so I agree with your approach, Sean.
Okay, it sounds like people are comfortable with the approach.
I'll be happy to volunteer as one of the 2.
I'm happy to volunteer to be the other, but if someone is eager, I'll defer to them. Go for it. All right.
Very exciting assignment.
I'm really happy with that. I hope, given all the work that went into the master plan, that we kind of think through the bigger communications that were agreed upon. I assume those remain priorities and
under the umbrella of beginning the implementation of the master plan.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, good point.
And I think CU South, some things like that also.
Yeah.
And also knowing that the council's going to do a deep dive through a task force on finances this year.
That's true, yeah.
The issue of, like we were discussing tonight, how not to add to our costs by doing some things at the same time that we're going to need to spend considerable amounts of money.
Yeah. I know Tom and I would encourage you to send us ideas, just like Hal's, so we can use them. Thanks.
To give you a little bit of more of background, so what council is proposing to do this year, which is a little bit different, is that they're going to assign 1 or 2 council members to a particular board. So out of the dozens or so of board commissions, each will have a representative, maybe 2 representatives from council. And their charge is to make sure they go through your feedback, as well as what is also being requested at the staff level is, which we get requested every year as well, is what is our 2020 work plan? And they don't want all 265 discrete projects we have going on, but what are those 5 to 7 type of big projects that probably will overlap somewhat with yours, but this is, well, I think with this, you can go a little bit further than maybe what you're charged with doing. And that 1 or 2 rep will also look at our staff major work plan items. Between those 2, they'll bring those forward at the retreat that council's going to be having in mid-December or mid-January, and provide a little PowerPoint, so each board or commission will get a short report back from their council rep, and from that, council will end up establishing their top priorities for the next 2 years. So that's sort of their process.
And hopefully the board's comments and the staff's comments are basically the same. I mean, we don't want the board's priorities or thoughts to be radically different than the staff.
I would not expect it to be, just because of the template that we are following. It probably allows us to add some more items, like developing a master plan implementation framework is obviously a huge department work plan item. It's not going to rise probably to a council priority, but that's probably something that will show up on our list of top work plan items that may not show up on yours as a city priority, but I would expect that your priorities will end up on our list, if that's the way.
So you're saying staff is also submitting a list of priorities to council?
We are asked to describe at a high level our 2020 work plan items.
Okay, thanks.
Such as those things that showed up on their CIP. And so, again, I would expect to be overlapped. It's just what we're charged to do. We probably can say a few more things than, than the 3 you're restricted to.
Okay. Are there any other matters that anyone else on the board wants to raise? Okay. Then we're adjourned.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Live from Paris, en France 24.